Good morning. Can everybody please take your seats? Welcome. This is pretty frickin' awesome. Wow. I just want to say welcome. I'm Alice Stebbins. I'm the Executive Director of the California Public Utilities Commission. And, you know, when we started to do this about 3 months ago, we're thinking, I wonder if anybody will really want to come, be interested. So, congratulations and thank you for being here. I want to thank our sponsors. I want to thank the steering committee. Just a huge effort of folks working together to make this happen. But I want you guys to do me a favor. I want you to take your hand and do this. I want you to look at your neighbor and go, bam, and go, we are here to kick Fire's ass. And with that, I'm going to introduce our first speaker. He is the senator for the 3rd District in California. He has personally seen the devastation of fire, being a resident of Napa. I'll introduce the Honorable Bill Dodd.
Well, good morning, everybody. What a great crowd. Well, you know, it's great to be back here on the campus of Sacramento State. I haven't been here in a long time, and it's really amazing how much it's grown. But I appreciate the opportunity, along with Alice, to open up this session, which I think is incredible. You know, the Technology Innovation Summit, along with the CPC, you know, working together, and many, many other groups. I believe the summit is a great way to demonstrate that a combination of research and technological know-how will help in moving California forward in our challenges to prevent and respond to future wildfires. In October of 2017, much of my Senate district was devastated by raging wildfires. More than 40 of my constituents died in those fires, and over 7,000 lost their homes and nearly everything that they owned. This catastrophic event thrust me into the middle of the legislative debate about what our state can do to best prevent and respond to these future disasters. As many of you know, I became the author of last year's SB 901, a multifaceted bill addressing electric utility wildfire mitigation, better forest management, the deployment of wildfire fighting resources, and much, much more. Little did I know at the time that SB 901 would also reveal an ongoing world of technological research and innovation occurring in the private and public sectors related to many of the wildfire issues addressed in this bill. So thank you all very, very much for your hard work and over the years. Since the enactment of SB 901, I've had a number of meetings with folks who are developing a vast array of devices, software, and other tools to predict, identify, prevent, respond, and fight wildfires, as well as assist people from being overcome by a wildfire should one of these occur in or nearby their homes or communities. A few days ago, the Senate Governmental Organizations Committee, which I chair, along with its Assembly counterpart, held a morning-long hearing to discuss many of these innovations. I'm truly amazed about what is out there to help reduce and minimize wildfire risk. I'm certain you will see and hear much more about this during today's summit. Last November, I had the opportunity to tour San Diego Gas and Electric's Wildfire Weather Prediction Center. And I think that's truly a hub of cutting-edge technology and science that demonstrates that wildfire prevention and response resources our public and private agencies now have at their disposal, but we need much more. And I'm committed to seeing that these kind of wildfire prevention and response resources, as well as the operational protocols utilized by SDG&E, become standard for all of our California electric utilities, whether they be public or investor-owned. To that end, I have introduced SB 209 this year, which would create the California Wildfire Warning Center, or CWWC, operated by the Office of Emergency Services, CAL FIRE, and the California Public Utilities Commission in partnership with California's electric utilities and our universities. Among other things, the CWWC will be responsible for ongoing monitoring or fire weather and related and threat conditions, as well as ongoing improvement of fire weather forecasting models. The CWWC will receive, coordinate, and verify information pertaining to fire threat conditions, utility proactive de-energization of power lines, and active fire events. The CWWC will also oversee the development and deployment of a statewide network of automated weather and environmental stations, and the CWWC will oversee the development of a validated and uniform fire threat potential index and operational protocols for each level of fire threat. I totally believe that a statewide wildfire warning center, working with our best academic and research organizations, along with our electric utilities, will result in a powerful wildfire prevention and response tool. And I expect much of the technology that we hear about today will be enacted by the CWWC. Before I take that one step further, we all need to understand one thing. While I'm really high on this, I've got a long way to go, and this has got to make it through both houses of the California State Legislature and ultimately get signed by the governor. But that's what hard work's all about. This is what you're doing today and what you've been doing in your communities, in your businesses, for some time. So in conclusion, I want to point out that the power of technology will amplify the benefits of many other activities the legislature, local governments, industry, and our brave firefighting organizations like CAL FIRE and local fire authorities are actively pursuing, such as creating defensible space around communities, vegetation management, and nearby utility lines, home hardening, and instituting better land use practices. I am confident that we, with all the knowledge each of you bring to the effort reducing wildfire threat and risk, we will tame and contain and keep wildfires from becoming the kind of catastrophes we've seen in recent years, and we will kick wildfire's ass. Thank you. Thanks a lot, and have a great summit.
All right, thank you, Senator Dodd. This time I'd like to introduce to the stage Ed Struzik. He's a writer, educator, public speaker, and fellow at the Institute for Energy and Environmental Policy in the School of Policy Studies at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. His articles and essays appear in journals, magazines, and newspapers such as Scientific American, Foreign Policy Review, and the Los Angeles Times. He's earned more than 30 international and national awards for his writing and his books, and his latest book, Firestorm, How Wildfire Will Shape Our Future, is currently an Amazon bestseller. Ed?
There we are, thank you. I think I'm the light entertainment here, and in a superficial way, I'm going to tell you how we got here, and then I think the rest of the conference will tell us where we're going to go from here. Let's just start off with a simple equation. What's required to start a fire? Oxygen, heat, and fuel. You all know that. But what happened? What was fire like before Europeans arrived on the scene? We don't really know, but a lot of charcoal sediments have suggested that we had a lot of fire in the past. And then there was a distinct lull in fire right around 1600 to 1800. That corresponded with the Little Ice Age, where things were pretty cool and wet for globally around that time. If anybody are explorer fans, know anything about the Franklin expeditions and the search for the Northwest Passage through the Arctic, one of the reasons why they failed so miserably was because there was so much ice up there during that little ice age. Their timing was really unfortunate. We also know that lightning strikes accounted for an unknown but probably a significant amount of fires before Europeans arrived on the scene. But humans were still part of the equation before us Europeans arrived. We do know that indigenous people routinely lit fires on the landscape, both in the forests and the grasslands of North America. How do we know this? Well, Lewis and Clark, who traveled across the continent in the 1820s, they recorded this. The plains are on fire in view of the fort on both sides of the river. It is said to be common for the Indians to burn the plains near their villages every spring for the benefit of the horse and to induce the buffalo to come near them. They didn't really comment on this, but they found it very peculiar. David Douglas, the botanist, the British botanist, who the Douglas fir is named after, also noticed this and commented on it, but found it very peculiar. Others that followed used words such as insane, criminal. This shouldn't happen. One of the first Europeans to really understand the nature of fire and its importance to the landscape was Henry David Thoreau. He accidentally set the forest on fire around Walden Pond and realized 2 or 3 years later, after things started greening up rather nicely, that, as he said, I have set fire to the forest, but I have done no wrong therein. And now it is as if the lightning had done it. These flames are but consuming their natural food. And he compared a forest to a broom that sweeps and ventilates the forest floor and makes it clear and clean. Thoreau, of course, was ahead of his time. But the problem is that most of the early settlers came from, like many of you here, from Great Britain, where fires, significant fires, were not part of their culture or their landscape. And they came to North America at a time when this little ice age was producing a lot of cool, wet weather. So they didn't really have to deal with fire. But then the little ice age started to peter out and things started getting a lot warmer. And this higher temperatures produced a lot more lightning, and it sets the stage for some very big fires on the landscape. And a fire as big as the Miramichi fire, which burned in Maine and New Brunswick in 1825, was absolutely catastrophic. No one knows how many people died, but quite likely thousands. It was one of the biggest fires in North American history. And no one knew how to deal with that fire. And the pastors, the ministers who were in charge of the churches, recorded the reaction to it. Those fortunate enough to be near a river took refuge in the water, often trying to coax their cows and pigs with them. The livestock were panicked by the smoke and the flames and refused to enter. Most of them succumbed to the heat and the smoke. Wild animals had no such fear. The humans in the rivers found themselves surrounded by wildlife, including raccoons, deer, bears, and moose, if you could imagine that scene. They just didn't have firefighting resources. They just did not know how to deal with this. And so what happened as things started to get progressively warmer, big fires followed with increasing frequency. We had the Peshtigo Fire of 1871, 400 to 1,200 people dead, 1.2 million acres burned. And you can see in the quotes from people who witnessed this that this was just surreal. They really didn't understand it. And think about, when I'm talking about this, think of the parallels to today. The menacing crimson reflection on the western sky was rapidly increasing in size and intensity. In the midst of the unfractured calm and silence reigning around, the strange and terrible noise of fire, strange and unknown thunderous voice of nature. Hinckley Fire of 1894 in northern Minnesota killed 418 people, burned 160,000 acres. It was started by lumber companies that were operating in the area. The Great Fire of 1908 in Fernie in British Columbia in Canada, it burned 90% of the town, and it was the second fire that burned the town in 5 years. The Porcupine Wildfire of 1911 in northern Ontario, 200 dead, 500,000 people, 500,000 acres burned. And the description of that was a fire tornado sucked the oxygen out of the atmosphere with such force that mature trees were ripped from the ground. People who took refuge in the mine shafts were asphyxiated. Others drowned when a boxcar of dynamite exploded by the shores of Porcupine Lake. The wealthy owner of one of the mines in the regions died trying to save his cat. Then there was the Great Fire of 1910, really an historic fire in North America. There was 1,736 fires smoldering pretty much across Idaho and Montana that year. And then in late August, hurricane-force winds came in, and in 3 days, 3 million acres burned. 86 people died. A lot more would have died had the military and the railroad companies not come in to be able to assist. And Ferdinand Silcox, who was head of the U.S. Forest, who became the head of the U.S. Forest Service, was one of the witnesses to the fire. And again, you get this intonation in their reaction to this, that this is just surreal, that we really don't understand the nature of this beast. The roar from these fires was heard for miles and was likened by some of the rangers in their path to the noise of 1,000 freight trains coming, crossing simultaneously. They just couldn't comprehend the power of this force. And some people started to think that maybe we've got to figure out another way of dealing with fire. And George Hoxsey, who was a forester here in California, had one of the famous quotes that said, "We'd best adopt fire as our servant, otherwise it will be our master." And he suggested we do what those indigenous people did, light small fires to reduce the amount of fuel on the ground that could burn in the forest. The state engineer of California was for it. A lot of timber owners were for it. The Southern Pacific Railroad was in favor of it. And remember, railroad companies were starting a lot of fires in those days as well. He may have prevailed had a fourth element not been added to the fire triangle following the big burn of 1910. Politics. The big burn of 1910 ignited a culture of wildfire suppression. Politically, something had to be done to adapt to this new reality, and I think that every politician around today, especially in California, understands that. Henry Graves, the head of the U.S. Forest Service from 1910 to 1920, he declared that forest fire protection is the first measure necessary for the successful practice of forestry. His successor, William Greeley, vowed it would never happen again, that wildfire was a menace, prescribed burning was evil, and fire prevention is the #1 job of the American foresters. Bernard Fernau, who was the first chief of the U.S. Forest Service, came to Canada and brought this philosophy along with him. And he saw fire as the worst enemy. Forest is crops that needed to be harvested, not burned, and conflagrations are due largely to bad habits and loose morals. So in the decades that followed, a number of strategies were implemented to reduce the amount of fire on the landscape. The first thing that we did, both in Canada and the United States, was we kicked indigenous people out of our national parks. Yosemite, Yellowstone, Banff, and Jasper, they were all told to leave for a variety of reasons, but one of them was that they lit fires, and this would deter tourists from coming to visit these national parks. A more organized, institutionalized forest fighting strategy was put into place, and Ferdinand Silcox, the famous quote that he had about the big burn of 1910, he came up with a quick action strategy. All fires would be controlled by 10 a.m. of the day following discovery. Didn't always work, but that was the goal. So they built lookouts to detect fires in the forest. Heliographs were used by rangers to send fire messages by means of a mirror and the sun's rays. Tree phones were used to communicate the location of a fire. The U.S. Forest Service actually experimented with homing pigeons to cut down on costs. Didn't work. A wildfire control center dispatched firefighters by foot, by horse, by truck, by boat. We actually had fireboats on the Mississippi. We had them in Canada on the Athabasca and the Mackenzie River, on hand-levered pump trolleys, by rail car, by train. The U.S. established the Civilian Conservation Corps during the Depression, and they were called, a corps of them was called the Roosevelt's Tree Army. And between 1933 and 1942, 6.5 million days were spent fighting forest fires. The Royal Canadian Air Force, after the First World War, ended up deploying their aircraft to find forests in the boreal forests. And the U.S. Forest Service did the same thing. And once a fire was detected from the air, the guy there in the back seat would drop a roll of toilet paper as a streamer to show the men on the ground where the fire was. And so they would follow these rolls of toilet paper streaming along the forest. That didn't always work either. And we also used smoke jumpers starting in 1939, and this is what I like best. In Oregon, they experimented with transplanting beavers into wilderness areas where they could not go because beavers would create dams and then would condition forest away from dryness and burning. That wasn't the sole reason. They also wanted trees to grow quickly in these areas. And they actually came up with this idea that they would build these little cages and then fly them and parachute them down onto the ground. And then hopefully either they would crash and survive, or the beavers would chew their way out because it was made out of wood. It was short-lived, as you probably can understand. But the beaver prevails because there's actually an attempt right now to reintroduce beavers to the parts of California. And the word of warning there is that in Patagonia, they reintroduced beavers, 50 of them in the 1930s, and there's something like 200,000 beavers now flooding vast areas of territory. They've become a landscape disaster. Civilians on both sides of the border were encouraged to participate. Advertising was used to demonize fires. Wildfires were likened to the bombs of war, and in fact they were. The Japanese actually got the idea of creating a balloon, and they sent 9,000 of these balloons during the war, towards the tail end of the war, over to the United States, and balloons would fall, and they had a sort of a gas bomb, and the idea would be to light up the forests of North America. And they're still being found occasionally. They didn't work, and part of the reason was they launched the balloons in fall when everything was very wet, and so they landed in sort of a snowy forest. Bar Harbor, 1947 in Maine, it was a huge fire. It was so big that they brought in the Canadians to help, and it's a lasting legacy because now we have basically an international corps of firefighters, and the Northeast Fire Compact grew out of the Bar Harbor fire, and I just spoke to them a couple of months ago. Smoky Fair, of course, became the symbol in the effort to promote fire prevention. We use science to add sophistication to fire suppression strategies. The results between 1920 and 1950, we had about 10 to 50 million acres of forest burned annually in the United States. By the 1950s, annual burned area was as low as 1.9 million acres. Now, I'm not sure that can all be attributed to fire suppression, but a lot of it was. It worked. It worked really well, and you can see it in the photographs, the repeat photographs here in the Rocky Mountains. You see 1917 to 2012. There's a lot less trees back then because the indigenous people were lighting fires. And so when you go through Yosemite, Banff, and Jasper National Parks, and especially Banff and Jasper, and you see these beautiful, endless forests of pine trees, they're all about 120, 130 years old, and they're just waiting to burn. So the next big story after California, I predict, is going to be the Rocky Mountains in Canada, which haven't really had a big fire for some time. And of course, Yellowstone was really a turning point. There was a lot of experimentation going here with light burning in California, but California was always ahead of its time. And then the century-long demonization of fire continued in 1988. Many of you in the room probably remember. They decided to allow some fires that burned in the back country to burn themselves out. But the timing was unfortunate because it was a record hot year. It didn't rain all summer long, and Yellowstone burned like it never had before. 240 fires burned that year, put fear in the hearts of just about everybody. It appeared in the Los Angeles Times 33 times on the front page that summer. Time magazine put it on the cover. Everyone had a comment on it. President Reagan dismissed the relatively new let burn policy in the national park as, you can imagine him saying this, cockamamie. And Interior Secretary Hodel described it as absurd, and he ordered national park officials to fight all fires from that point on. It set things back a little bit, but you know, you look at time really proved them all to be wrong at that time. Grizzly bears and black bears immediately moved onto the fire-scarred landscape to feed on the carrion that burned. Fire beetles moved in to lay their eggs on warm stumps, and if there were any firefighters here, you know the firefighters irreverently called them stump humpers because this is where they lay their eggs and reproduce. Nighthawks and woodpeckers come feeding on the beetles. Owls nest in snags, feeding their chicks rodents that were more exposed in the fire-scarred areas. And then aspen shoots shoot up even as the fires smoldered. And then elk and bison moved in because they like the new aspen shoots that grow up. And the coniferous trees followed. And grizzly bears got fat. This was a project that I was involved in Jasper National Park. We started capturing grizzly bears in the 1990s to try to, in Jasper and outside of the adjacent areas to try to determine, you know, what they needed to survive. But no one could figure out why the bears in the national parks tended to be skinnier and smaller than the bears in the unprotected areas outside of the park. And this was a real head scratcher for a long time until a biologist by the name of Scott Nielsen figured it out. The bears in Jasper didn't do well because it had just huge canopy that was blocking out the sun rays from hitting the forest floor where the berries and the root vegetables that the bears feed on in areas where, you know, they can't get carrion or a deer or other animals. And so in the areas where there was some fragmentation where fires were allowed to burn, there was a lot more there for them to eat. 30 years later in Yellowstone National Park, it's pretty hard to detect any evidence of that fire. But the problem is a new reality comes into play, and we know all about it, climate change. It's began to intensify droughts, disease. We all know about disease in California, more than 100 million trees dead. This was another project that I was involved in Jasper National Park, and this continues to take my breath away when I think about it. We flew for 7 days looking for mountain pine beetle infected trees. In 2010, after a week of flying, we could only find 400 trees that were infected. By 2017, we stopped counting trees. We're measuring it in hectares. 62,000 acres of national forest were infected by pine beetles, and it's even much more right now. These dead and dying trees are adding to the amount of fuel that can burn in the forest, and forest communities are adding to that fuel. And so drought, disease, and pests, as well as an increasing number of people in forested landscapes, began testing the limits of our firefighting resources. And I think really, you could probably pick any year, but I'm picking 2003 was really the harbinger of future fire seasons. That was a year that 25 fires burned 13% of Glacier National Park. 2,000 people were forced out of their homes all summer long in the Crow's Nest Pass area north of there. 1,000 people were evacuated from Oregon. Jasper National Park burned big. Banff nearly burned. Kootenai National Park burned. 45,000 people were evacuated in British Columbia that year. Cedar Fire in California was one of the biggest on record at that time, and it spread at a rate of 3,600 acres per hour. Even polar bear country burned, if you can believe it. On the west coast of Hudson Bay, where the boreal forest goes all the way up to the Arctic there, the subarctic area, there is a national park, a national monument, and it's just an old Hudson Bay building, and the National Park Service firefighters that were fighting all the fires in Western Canada were suddenly asked to send resources up to the Arctic to try to protect this building. And everybody thought, what the hell's going on? They saved the building, but dozens of polar bear dens collapsed by the heat of the fire. And I know this because I was involved in the survey. And just to let you know a little about me, I thought the one great thing that I wanted to do was to climb into a polar bear den. And that's me. The helicopter pilot and the other biologists were standing by. We made sure that the polar bears had actually left the den and were heading back out to the west coast of Hudson Bay to go back onto the sea ice to hunt seals again. And I got my picture, and then as I got back into the helicopter, the pilot gave me a little poke, and he pointed behind the den, behind a tree, was this big female polar bear with her 2 cubs looking curiously at us. So I'm never going to do that again. Resources were so strained in 2003 that military personnel and firefighters from all over the world were brought in to help, and it wasn't enough. Triage became the order of the day in some places in Western North America. And since 2003, we've seen destructive fires burning more often in increasingly unpredictable ways. And this is the thing that really does blow me away. We saw it in Canberra, the F2 tornado that it produced, and along with black hail, equivalent to 22 kilotons of TNT. Then on May 4th in 2016, the fire that burned near the oil sands town of Fort McMurray, it actually did burn part of the town of Fort McMurray, it created its own pyro-CB, its own lightning storm. There was not a cloud in the sky anywhere at the time to indicate that this was going to happen. And it ignited a cluster of fires 20 miles away from the fire front. And the wildfire scientists just could not believe it. They kept going over their data, trying to think, how is this possible? A cluster of 6 fires 20 miles away. That's how much energy that fire produced. And then in 2015, a slow-moving thunderstorm in Alaska shot out 62,000 lightning strikes in just 5 days, triggering 286 fires. No one had ever seen anything like that. And what really has to be, people must need to be reminded of, is that boreal forest of Alaska is basically the boreal forest of British Columbia, Alberta, northern Saskatchewan, northern Montana, Ontario, parts of the United States. So there's no reason why this won't happen anywhere else. And then in August 2017, we had the mother of all pyro-CB events, 4 fire-driven lightning storms in 5 hours in British Columbia, another one simultaneously occurring in Washington. And since then, and I have a friend at the U.S. Naval Defense Lab who's an expert in pyro-CBs, is completely blown away by. They've been seeing them in Texas, Portugal, South Africa, Argentina, Western Russia, where they've never been seen before. It all adds up to nightmares for wildfire managers and firefighters. It's also resulting in things that we couldn't have anticipated, major changes to land, rivers, and lakes. Wood Buffalo National Park in Canada in 2014, the fires were so intense they burned right into the duff and burned all of the seeds. We're not going to see that pine forest coming back for hundreds of years. It burned so much of the trees around the Mackenzie Bison Sanctuary in the same area that it created a flood. The upland trees all burned. There was nothing to absorb the moisture. It filled up the sanctuary, flooded it, sent the bison up into the uplands in areas that they do not prefer and onto the roads where they were getting hit by cars. And this is important because forests yield 40% of the water for world's 100 largest cities. And you see what happens after a really intense fire. This is Cameron Falls in Waterton National Park in Canada, which is right on the Montana border. In fact, the watershed starts in Montana. And it's one of the great tourist attractions is this waterfall, Cameron Falls. It's crystal clear, right out of the mountains. It's beautiful. Everybody comes there to take pictures. 1 year after that picture was taken, 1 year after, there was a fire that burned 70% of the green area in the national park. It moved about 20 miles from one end of the park to the other in about 12, 18 hours. You can see it. It flushed out all of the soot, all of the debris, and created a black waterfall for 2 or 3 days. And it creates a real threat to water supplies for populated areas. Look at San Francisco, gets 85% of its water from the Yosemite area Hetch, which was 4 miles away from the fires that burned in the area in 2018. It wasn't affected, but 2 of the 3 hydroelectric power stations that supply water to the city had to be shut down. So our utilities now are threatened, as we know, with PG and E, and our water treatment plants. Denver nearly lost its water treatment plant in 2002, Fort Collins in 2011. I think Canberra had to rebuild their water treatment treatment plant after the 2003 fires. And now cities all over North America and around the world are forced to re-examine their water treatment strategies because our technicians really, if you look at chlorine and carbon, can potentially produce carcinogenic substances. And our technicians aren't trained to be able to determine how much chlorine you can use. And so now we're hiring engineers to come in to try to put a fix on this. And there's a lot of municipalities that are really concerned about this. The other thing that's scary is about fires that might burn in many of our old mine sites, abandoned mine sites, are in forested areas. The one in Libby, Montana, the old asbestos mine that operated for 9 years, one of the most expensive super funds in the United States, $700 million already spent. And just as they were wrapping it up, a public health official from the University of Montana went in to see, because everybody used wood to heat their homes in the Libby area, wanted to know whether or not asbestos may be in the trees around the old asbestos site. And they found out it's not just around there, it was like miles and miles away. And when they did these fire tests, they found that the asbestos needles wouldn't burn. And so they went up with the plume of smoke, and we know these plumes of smoke can travel long, long distances. So how do we deal with the emerging challenges? This is what we're going to discuss here. Is it going to be more evacuations and more states of emergency, more fire suppression? Do we enact stay and defend legislation as Australia has? Well, it's a bit of a different forest. You look out here what happened at Pecami Creek in 2011. The boreal forest burns very hot there. And this was a fire that came in at the last minute, and the U.S. Forest Service had to come in with helicopters, ferrying people out there, and they had to leave their canoes behind. And you can see, it melted their canoes. So do we advise people to stay and defend in situations like that? Do we have better early warning strategies? I think so. But I'll give you another example. In Fort McMurray, in 2016, where 88,000 people had to be evacuated at the last minute, the head of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police realized at some point that she was going to have to create her own emergency response team because she felt that the provincial one was not moving fast enough. Remember, that fire was only 4 miles away from town. And she suddenly got a call on her cell phone. It was her sister-in-law, as they were having these roundtable meetings 24 hours a day to try to figure out, what to do if their fire did come to town. And she looked at it. There was a house burning, and she texted back her sister and said, "What is this? What?" She said, "It's the house across the street." And that was the first she heard of the fire entering the town. And then she and her staff all went to the window and saw this mass evacuation taking place. So, many communities are still behind the 8 ball. And one of the problems is that a lot of these communities, there's a fear of drawing lines in the sand, such as Fort McMurray. If Fort McMurray was 6-8 kilometers away, we know a fire can move. Look at Los Angeles area, San Diego. They can move very, very quickly. But they refused to pull the trigger. One of the reasons why, I'm pretty sure, is that you had the oil sands, trillion-dollar industry that would have to shut down and ramp back up. They would lose a lot of revenue. People would be out of jobs. And if you leave it to local emergency response teams, they're pressured politically. So something has got to be done to make the lines in the sand much clearer. Public education preparedness, better building and landscaping codes, these are all given. Fire smarting, more fire breaks, allowing lightning-triggered lightning storms to burn themselves out, which is very difficult in California because you got far too many people on the landscape. More clear-cutting, that's problematic. Investing more in science and artificial intelligence, and we can see this is a big part of the conference here, but let me tell you what governments are doing. The Canadian Forest Service, for example, employed 2,400 people in the 1990s, less than 700 work for them today. Only 100 to 110 of them are scientists, and only 11 of them are on work on Wildfire. And in yesterday's budget for the Canadian government, they recognized wildfire was a problem. Guess how much they are investing over the next 5 years? $6 million a year for the next 5 years. And look at President Trump asking for $902 million, $21 million less than the current budget. We still need politicians at the federal, state, provincial levels to take note of this. I think California is way ahead of this because they've obviously got some serious problems. Do we have time? I think California is a harbinger of what's to come to the rest of the world, so as Australia has already seen it. 14, I think possibly 15 now, the biggest fires have occurred since 2003. Projected increase of 74 to 118% in the coming years. How is this going to play out? We're going to see changes in forest structure, water quality may be degraded, utilities are going to continually be threatened, fish populations are going to suffer, old growth forest animals may be threatened, highway closures in Canada and the United States, we've seen these economic routes, these lifelines have been shut down for days and days at a time. Visits to national parks could be curtailed. Timber harvesting may be restricted. Communities and government assets will be threatened. And air quality, again, everybody in California knows what that is all about, is going to worsen. Business as usual is not going to be successful. How bad could it get? This is the fire that I think really could signal what we might see in the future. And it was a fire that burned in northern British Columbia and Alberta in 1950. No one died, but it made headlines all around the world. It burned for 222 days and torched a stretch of forest that was 175 miles long. And some of the newspaper headlines were, remember this is in the days when there was no internet, rumors of war with Russia, hampered search for US B-50 bomber, aircraft grounded, suspected atomic explosion, cows milked ahead of schedule, chickens went to roost, lights were put on for afternoon baseball games, including at Yankee stadiums. Street lights turned on during the day, and utilities caused a number of blackouts because of the great demand for power. There was in Denmark a run on the banks when the plume of smoke actually got overseas, and it created this blue moon, and everybody panicked. And you know what the first thing that they did when they saw this blue moon, what they did the next morning? They went to the bank to get their money because that was going to be the end of the world. So we've got some choices. We could have the good fires, such as the Yellowstone fires, the manageable fires that our firefighters can deal with, or we're going to have some truly ugly fires down the road. And that's what you're going to discuss here today, and I'm looking forward to the next 2 days because I think this is going to be a very, very exciting event. Thank you very much.
All right, now I'd like to introduce to the stage David Pierce. Dr. Pierce is a scientist at UC San Diego Scripps Institute of Oceanography. He holds a PhD in physical oceanography from the University of Washington, a Master's of Science from the University of Washington, and a Bachelor's of Science in Physics from UC Santa Cruz.
Thank you very much for the invitation to speak here. I'm going to talk about climate trends in California and fire risk. And a lot of this work comes out of the recently completed 4th California Climate Assessment, of which a number of us were part of. And I'm going to just talk about some of my co-authors here for a second. Dan Can, Julie Klansky, Leroy Westerling at UC Merced, and Alexander Kirshnov at SIO. So I'm going to be showing work from all these people and how it affects future trends in fire risk. So I think you know that climate change is predicting a warmer world, and that part's not new to you. What I want to focus on is some of the more nuanced issues that will affect how fires develop and propagate across our landscape. So one point is that extreme hot days have a larger proportional increase than ordinary hot days. So the worst days, the really bad days, are going to increase more. So if you look, for example, at that top left figure, that's for Sacramento. We're in Sacramento right now. The x-axis is just showing the progression from 1950 over to 2100 in the future. And how high the column is shows how many days you expect to get of the temperature at least indicated by the numbers here. So if you look at 90 degrees Fahrenheit, you see you go from about 75 days per year to 150 days per year. So 90-degree days about double. But look at the bottom there, 105-degree days. That's way more than doubling. That's more like tripling. In these really rare, extremely hot days, over 110, those go up by much more than that. So the very worst days get proportionally more frequent. And that has this drying effect on the landscape. That's going to be one of the main points of my talk here. Besides the increase in the very hot days, the warming that we expect to see is not uniformly distributed across our landscape. So you're going to get most of the warming in the interior of the state, for example, in the Sierra Nevada. If you look at the right panel here, this is the change in the average hottest day of the year by the end of the century for the high carbon gas emissions scenario. And I'm focusing on the high greenhouse gas emissions scenario because we've been on that trajectory since about 2000. And if you look at the state of the world, I don't see any indication we're really going to drop off that. But the lower emission scenarios on the left for comparison. So if we look at the right-hand panel, you'll get increases of about 10 degrees Fahrenheit in the hottest day of the year over much of the Sierra Nevada. Closer to the coast, those increases are mitigated because you're near the ocean, and the ocean has this incredible capacity to suck up heat. So you get the biggest increases in the Sierra Nevada. And I always like to emphasize this because when I listen to the news, a lot of people talking about climate change will say, well, we predict some increase in temperature of the Earth. Well, as you know, most of the Earth is covered with water, so that average is not that relevant unless you happen to live in the ocean, which most of us do not. So the average temperature change over land is higher than those average numbers you hear. So I think those average numbers can be quite misleading. Not only over the landscape will it change, but across the time of year, the warming will be different as well. So what I'm showing here is on the x-axis is the month of the year. So this is showing the change in the annual cycle of warming. How much change in degrees Celsius is on the vertical axis. If we just look at the top red line here for the end of the century, you see you get more warming towards the end of summer, and you get less warming in very late winter. So again, this is another one of those cases that I find annoying because people talk about, oh, the average temperature is going to go up 3.5 degrees Celsius, but it's hiding all these really important details. We don't want warming at the end of summer. That's really awkward for this audience when you're thinking about wildfires, and yet that's when most of the warming will happen. Now, why do you get this difference over time of year? What's happening is that the land surface is drying out. So as temperatures go up, you're progressively drying out the landscape. Sunlight, when it hits the surface, can do two things. It could evaporate water, or it can increase the temperature of the surface. Once you run out of water, once the surface gets really dry, more of it goes to warming. So that's why you get more warming in the end of summer when that landscape is really parched. And that's going to be a consistent theme in what I'm talking about here. Another interesting aspect I find is that the extra warming that people will experience during heat waves is actually elevated along the coasts. So there'll be this general warming, days will get warmer, summer will get warmer, the interior will get warmer preferentially, but it turns out during heat waves specifically, the coasts will get warmer than the interior. And the colors here are showing how much warmer a heat wave day is than an average day by the end of the century. And what you see is along the coast, you get this band of about 2 degrees Celsius, call that 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit, where the heat waves are preferentially warmer. And the reason that's happening is because, remember, the interior is warming up more than the coast? Well, that's the average picture, but then you've got these Santa Ana days are generally just days when the wind is blowing offshore and carrying all this extra warm air to the coast. So the coast during those few days when the wind's blowing in the wrong direction because it's bringing this hot interior air to the coast, they get extra warm. So that's going to have a lot of impact on, say, energy use and human health because there's low air conditioner installations along the coast right now, though that might change in the future. But it also is going to affect things like Santa Ana's when you've got those extra hot days. So let's turn now to precipitation, and the changes in precipitation are distributed across the year just like the changes in temperature are. And one thing that people don't necessarily know is that our wet season is going to be compressed. So here in California, we'll probably get a little bit more precipitation overall. I'll show that in a second. But it's going to follow more in winter and less in spring and autumn. So if you look at that red curve there, again, this is the cycle of changes across the year. So the months on the x-axis and the changes vertically. You see you get an increase in winter precipitation, but look how it ducks down in early spring. So decrease in precipitation in spring, and again a decrease in precipitation in autumn. So what's happening is that the wildfire season is going to be expanding out. This window is going to be getting bigger where you have these dry conditions. And you're packing even more precipitation into this narrower winter window where you have these large storms. And that actually has quite a lot of implications for flooding, which I think is going to be extremely bad in the future. That's not our subject here, but unfortunately we're going to be affected by it. I mentioned before that it's going to get wetter in the winter and so forth. Let me show the annual average change, how it plays out over the state. So this is the annually average. Wetter in the northern part of the state, slightly drier in the southern part of the state. So again, that's good for water resources in the sense that we get most of our water in California from the northern part of the state. So the overall amount is going up a little bit, even though it's coming in this narrower season, so there's more potential for flooding. In the numbers here, you can see the wettening is maybe 4 to 8%, somewhat modest. It would be hard to see because we have huge year-to-year variability, but this is the trend. And there's physical reasons for thinking that this is likely to play out this way. Southern part of the state, drying of a few percent, so that's not helpful, but at least the water supply looks okay. But this is hiding all this information about how changes are going to happen over the seasons. So the middle figure here is how the changes play out in winter. And you can see in winter, this pattern's exaggerated. You've got increases over most of the state. The increases are bigger, 4 to 8 to 12% even, over the northern part of the state in this narrower window, hence the concern about flooding. But in spring, this is March, April, May on the right, you can see this incredible drying. So values over 20% in the southern part of the state. So that's really quite a very strong and consistent signal. It's coming because the jet stream is moving northward due to changes in the temperature configuration in the northern hemisphere. So we have confidence that this is likely to play out. And it has this really big impact on the window at which you'll get wildfire activity because of the drying in the spring and autumn. Now, I always think of the intersection of temperature and precipitation as the snowpack. So what I've illustrated here is projected changes in the amount of spring snowpack. This is by the end of the century. And the left-hand side now, again, is the lower emissions scenario. The right-hand side is the larger emissions scenario. So you can see how much difference people's actions might theoretically have if we changed how much greenhouse gas we were emitting. Let's look at the right-hand panel because that's the trajectory we're actually on. So the changes in snowpack, those brown numbers mean a decrease of 90% or more by the end of the century under this scenario. And you can see in the northern part of the state, a lot of the snowpack goes away basically by spring. This is April 1st, when historically the snowpack was at a maximum. The southern part of the state is not as, the southern part of the snow-bearing state, the high Sierra Nevada, is not as much affected. You probably know that the Sierra Nevada are a little bit anti-intuitive in that they tilt up to the south. So the higher, colder, more snowy parts of the Sierra are in the south, which kind of throws you off the first time you hear that. But they're higher elevation, so they're less affected by this warming. The lower elevation northern part of the state, where a lot of water resources are harvested, is more affected by this loss of snowpack. And we count on the snowpack to be our reservoir of water to a large degree in California. So this is like saying some of our reservoir capacity goes away. Then you have to figure out what to do about that. Now, why is this immediately relevant to a wildfire talk? Well, people have looked at the effect of snow cover on wildfire. So this is some work by Leroy Westerling at UC Merced. And what he's done here is he's looked at years where there was a late snowmelt in the wildfire activity, and that's shown in the left-hand panel. And when there was early snowmelt in the wildfire activity in the right-hand panel. And each dot there represents a fire of at least 1,000 acres, and the size of the dot is proportional to the size of the fire. And what you can see is there's a strong relationship such that when you have a late snowmelt, you have a lower fire activity. Earlier snowmelt is really strongly associated with increased fire activity. So there's a couple of reasons for this. Number one, when you've got the snow cover on the ground, it's reflective, so you get less warming in the spring as the sun gets higher in the sky. And number two, it releases that water into the ground. So, that release of water is moistening the fuel load and supplies water to the plants, the bushes, the grasses, and so on. That's the reason for this relationship. This drying of the land surface is one of the key features of how climate change affects wildfires. So I've indulged myself by showing a quantity here that's a little bit obscure, but let me walk you through it. This is called the climatic water deficit, and it's how much more water could be evaporated from a surface than actually is evaporated from a surface. So if you got warm temperatures, a lot of sunlight, you could evaporate a whole bunch of water from the surface. But if you literally run out of water, if the water surface gets so dry you can't evaporate anymore, you have a really big difference between what could be evaporated and what actually is evaporated. That's the climate water deficit, and it's what's driving a lot of these changes in wildfire that you see in the climate model projections. So let's look at the right-hand panel here. Again, that's the high emission scenario. The left-hand one is the medium emission scenario. And the colors are the change in percent of this climatic water deficit. And what you see is that over much of the Sierra Nevada, it increases by 60 to 80%. So you're getting this really big increase in the potential for drying of the land surface. And that's including the vegetation, the fuel on the surface, and so forth. So it has a really direct effect on the wildfire propensity, and that's really what's driving the changes in future fire that you see in the climate scenarios, this particular variable. So let me show you some of his detailed results. Again, this is from Leroy Westerling. And all this stuff, by the way, you can download both the original data if you want, and calculate for your particular region how things might be impacted, or look at different scenarios that I don't have time to talk about in a relatively brief talk, looking at population scenarios and where people settle and so forth. So there's a lot of different information from the 4th California assessment that's out there on the web. You can just download it, but these are just some selected results. So by mid-century, so 2035 to 2064, if we have no treatment of fuels, because of this increasing drying of the atmosphere, you will probably get about a 48% increase in wildfire activity. This is acres burned per year on average. And again, I refer you to the full report, but this is basically looking over a couple thousand scenarios of different populations, different climate models, different assumptions of where people settle and so forth. So this is kind of a bottom line number. It's not meant to imply that it's not affected by some of these other issues. By the end of the century, with no treatment, about 120% increase in acres burned per year. So really substantial increases driven by this desiccation of the land surface and the drying out of the vegetation. Now, he also looked at various effects of fuel treatment. So the treatment effects he looked at were thinning of the forest, controlled burns, and if you do that, you could reduce the projected increase in fire activity from 48% to 33% if you treated about half the available area. So as you can imagine, not everywhere over the landscape is amenable to fuel treatment. So he's looked at it a couple different ways, where if you treat half the potentially treatable area, the increase in fire area burned per year could drop from 48% to 33%. If you treated 90%, it could drop down to 28% increase in fire area burned per year. That's by mid-century. If we keep on this trajectory of greenhouse gases that we're currently on, 120% increase in fire acres burned per year by the end of the century with no treatment. If you treat half the potential area you could treat, that might drop to 100%. If you treat almost all of it, it might drop to 90%. So you can see a couple things. Number one, fuel treatment absolutely makes a difference. And number two, you still have a problem even with fuel treatment. And if you can look at the lower emission scenarios, they're reduced from this somewhat. They're about midway between the mid-century and end-of-century numbers if you start reducing how much greenhouse gas you emit as a society. Now, one good piece of good news here I'm happy to report is that there's been a lot of work recently on Santa Ana winds and how those are likely to change in the future. Well, what Alexander Gershnov and his co-authors have done here is looked at the change in Santa Ana wind activity over the Santa Ana wind season, which starts in about September and ends in late spring. So that heavy black line shows the change in projected Santa Ana wind activity, and you can see it's showing a decrease, so that's good, and a preferential decrease on the shoulder season of the Santa Anas. So in about September and October and November, it's really a pretty big decline in Santa Ana wind activity. And that's actually related to the drying of, I showed you before how the precipitation decreases in the spring and autumn. That's happening because storms are moving away from the region. So that also has this effect on the Santa Ana winds. During the mid part of the Santa Ana wind season, in about the middle of winter, a modest decline of, say, 12%, then dropping off slowly towards spring again. So that's actually good news. I'm happy to report that. Now, one small fly in the ointment here is that if you look at humidity, the driest days of the year actually increase. They become more dry. So the extremity of the dryness becomes more. And so if you look at the census of what the relative humidity is on Santa Ana wind days, you get an increase of these incredibly dry days over what we see today. So it's a little bit of a mixed message. Overall, the incidence of Santa Ana wind days is going to decrease, particularly in the shoulder season, but the very, very driest days are going to increase in the sense of more frequently you have these incredibly dry days because the entire atmosphere is becoming drier due to the higher temperatures. Now, one thing that we're working on the Santa Ana wind days is extending the results to higher resolution. The previous ones were done on a 10-kilometer grid, we're working on extending it to a 2-kilometer grid, which is about 1.2 miles. So this is just an animation showing some of the newest model runs of a particular Santa Ana wind event historically in 2004 over Southern California. So the colors there show the offshore wind velocity, and you can see that the newer model runs are really capturing a lot of details of the topography, for example, in the Los Angeles Basin and east of San Diego. So we're getting a better look at how the individual topography of hills and valleys is really steering these Santa Ana winds. And you have to get to a really fine spatial detail to be able to resolve that. That's new work. The existing work doesn't quite get there, but we're optimistic that that will move us towards the goal. So let me go ahead and summarize. Now, I personally get annoyed when I hear these average global climate temperature change numbers because it's a really varied response over different parts of the year and different parts of the landscape. There's going to be more warming over land than ocean, more over the interior than the coast on average. But heat wave magnitude will preferentially increase along the coast because then that really hot interior air is carried to the shore by offshore winds. So that's unfortunate for the people living there. Modestly wetter winter conditions overall, so that's a good thing actually for our water supply. But it's going to be in a compressed season, more coming during a shorter period, so the window at which you have dry conditions actually extends. And I should mention that unless we change how we manage our reservoirs, the precipitation that falls in winter right now generally runs out to the ocean so that the reservoirs have capacity to absorb damaging floods. So it's actually lost from the system, although the amount of water actually increases. So a strong decrease in snowpack, especially in Northern California. We're talking numbers for April 1st snowpack of 80, 90, 100% loss. And that's actually linked to an increase in wildfire. So that's going to have some real effects on us. Projections suggest about a 50% increase in wildfire in federal forest, area burned by mid-century. Again, there's different scenarios on that. I refer you to the population and emission scenarios of the full report if you're interested. But it can be mitigated by fuel treatment, so that's a good point of news. A general narrowing of the season for Santa Ana winds, but so they become more confined to winter. but the very driest Santa Ana winds actually increase due to the overall drying of the atmosphere. So thank you very much. Oh, no, that's fine.
All right. So we're running slightly ahead, and we'd like to take this opportunity to allow anyone in the audience to ask any questions they may have of Dr. Pierce. So I know there's microphones both set up in the middle of the room, and feel free to step up to them, and we have time for probably 2 or 3 questions.
This is the problem of having a talk after one that's talking about parachuting beavers. You know, it's well known in climate science you cannot do a talk after someone who talks about parachuting beavers because you cannot top that. So kudos to that.
All right, now's not the time to be shy.
Very sobering, thank you. My name is Genevieve Sharoma. I'm a new commissioner on the California PUC. I had the privilege of serving 20 years on the SMUD board, and over a dozen years ago, we asked our staff to look at what the impacts of climate change was going to have on our watershed, on our hydroelectric system, and it tracks with exactly what you're saying. This is maybe more of a sidebar question, but especially coming from Scripps, climate change will also have an effect on the food source, the oceans are going to be less of an environment for fish and wildlife, in the sea. And I'm sure, do you also have information on that as well? I mean, we need water, we need land, we need housing, we need affordable rates. We also need food. Has your institute also looked at that in terms of the climate change impacts?
Yeah, there's been quite a bit of work on agriculture. I think one of the special reports that was part of the 4th assessment may have covered agriculture specifically. But if we're talking about ocean resources, so fishing and so forth, one of the there's 2 main concerns, one of which is that you know how Coca-Cola kind of burns your throat? I mean, you all know that, right? If you drink Coca-Cola, it's because it's got carbonic acid, dissolved carbon dioxide in the drink. So as the carbon content of the atmosphere goes up, the pH of the ocean actually goes down, and that affects the critters at the base of the food chain. So there's a lot of concern that that's going to be disruptive to some of the higher level organisms, this acidification of the ocean. Now on land, there's been quite a bit of work looking at how the higher temperatures will affect crops, both things like fruit and nuts, which need particular cold days, and things like soybeans or so forth in the desert interior, which are right now grown by irrigation. And when you look at a lot of these crops, you see this interesting thing, which is that as you increase carbon and temperature, the yields of these crops typically goes up for a while, but which is good. But then it reaches a pretty bad fall off, and things toward the end of the century become rather unpleasant as the temperatures exceed what the plants can handle. So, people who are plant ecologists have pointed this out many times, that you're looking at some unsustainable directions of current agriculture. But I don't think right now that there's any consensus on how the planted crops and irrigation practices might change to mitigate those effects. Yes, so we have another question.
Yes, a question about the modeling and the data. In your models, was the carbon emissions data based on reduction in California emissions and projected CO2 concentrations, or was it based on worldwide model and reduction or loss of CO2?
Yeah, it was based on worldwide changes rather than California changes. And if I could just, spin on that for a second, this is something that, as a climate scientist, is interesting to me to see this interaction of, we had the 4th element of the triangle of politics. And the idea is that if someone comes forward and has ways in which you can actually address climate change, like hopefully California, then other people might follow. So it's not that California per se has such a huge lever in the actual amount of gas it emits that it can change the world, but it can change the world by leadership. I think that's the idea here. Did you have another question?
Yeah, this is a related question about the modeling. I was just wondering if you could expand on the details of how you downscaled the predictions to California to get those regional numbers that you were showing.
Yeah, this is one of those things where, I inflict long seminars on people just to explain how that downscaling works. I'll just say briefly that the way you do it is you look at the climate patterns in the model projections, you match them to historical analogs of how the world has worked over the training period of 1950 to 2005. So you find a good matching day for the model feature, and then you see on a fine scale, what did weather on that day look like? So you're taking, some future model day in 2070, it had this pattern of precipitation, whatever it happens to be. You look for a matching day in history and say, well, here's an example of what the individual day in the future could look like, because it looks really similar on the large scale. So as you can imagine, it's not a particular prediction of Sacramento getting rain or not. It's a statistical prediction in the sense of this is the likelihood of Sacramento getting rain, say, in the spring in the future. Okay, well, if there are no more questions, then thank you very much.
All right, and this time I'd like to introduce Jeff Johnson, the CEO of the Western Fire Chiefs Association. Chief Johnson has an extensive public safety background with broad experience at the local, the national, and the international level. He rose through the ranks to become the Tulane Valley Fire and Rescue Chief for 15 years, retiring in 2010 after a 32-year career. Chief Johnson has served as president of the International Association of Fire Chiefs, IAFC, the president of the Western and Oregon Chiefs, and is currently the CEO of the Western Fire Chiefs Association, which serves fire chiefs in the 11 western states from Guam and Saipan to Utah. Chief Johnson?
Thank you. Thank you. Hi, good morning. Well, it is great to be in Sacramento, and not only am I a retired fire chief and CEO of the Western, but I happen to live in Sisters, Oregon, which if you looked at Oregon, you'd realize that I live in the chimney of Oregon's wildfire threat. So not only do I deal with this on an academic and intellectual level and a professional level, but I live it every day. All summer, we're dealing with the effects of wildfire. Before I invite up our panelists, I want to make some opening remarks about where I think wildfire is in the fire community, especially in the West. And probably preeminent amongst those observations is that first, the problem with wildfire is a Western phenomenon predominantly. It's not that wildfire doesn't happen across the country, it most certainly does. But the fact is, the magnitude, scope, and scale of wildfire in the West is unreplicated throughout the country. And while we're dealing with these issues on a national level, the fact is the petri dish of America's fire service and wildfire solutions are going to come out of the West. And when you put the 11 Western states into a box and you look in that box and see who's most likely to lead that conversation and those outcomes, it's California. You find yourselves uniquely positioned to lead a solution on a national basis. And there's a lot of factors associated with it, but make no mistake, once again, California and their western neighbors are going to be the states that lead our country in terms of finding true and real viable solutions to the wildfire problem. As the Western Fire Chiefs, we were mentioned there, we cover from Saipan to the western border of Colorado. And if you look at the maps that were thrown up on the wall, you know, the biggest problems in this country with wildfire, they're happening in our area. The one thing the fire service does better than anybody else is we share and we cooperate. It's probably lost on people that are not fire people, but in most states, there is one, maybe 2 layers of fire protection. You may have the city or county or a fire district, and then you may have in California, CAL FIRE that's over the top of that, and that's it. When they're out of resources, we're ringing up our neighbors. It's Nevada, Oregon, Arizona, Utah, Washington, and they're cooperating and sharing. If you created the same parallel in law enforcement, it isn't the same at all. If you think about the levels of law enforcement, you have city, you have the county sheriff's office, you typically have state patrol of some type. And then you bring in the federal resources. You have Customs and Border Patrol, FBI, ATF. Typically, there are 16 levels of law enforcement at a minimum in any square foot of America where there is 1, maybe 2 for fire. And what that means is that the fire community has had to perfect sharing and cooperating. And if we were to talk to Chief Zagaris, and by the way, Chief Zagaris, congratulations on an incredible career. Thank you for your service. If we were to talk to Chief Zagaris about the deployments that happen on your typical summer, he would paint you a very startling picture about the inflow of fire resources into California, and sometimes it goes the other way, and that's the mutual part of mutual cooperation. But what we do know is that we're going to need more cooperation, and we, for the first time really, are going to get out of our box and start looking at you. Because the true solutions to wildfire, comprehensively, are going to be solved not just by people that have red trucks. This is going to be solved by land use and transportation. This will be solved by policy on agriculture and forest management. This will involve transportation and technology and virtually every aspect of state, county, and city policymaking. Because the reality is that when you call the fire department, it is already too late, and now we're just trying to mitigate what has already occurred. It is going to require all of you in this room, and it is going to be such a broad-based conversation, I think there's going to be plenty of room to contribute. We're also going to see for the first time the approach and the application of technologies that have previously not been available to the public safety community. There's a number of drivers in that. First is the creation of a nationwide public safety broadband network. The creation of a nationwide public safety broadband network gives industry something to evolve around. They get to innovate around it, they get to evolve around it, and you're going to see applications, you're going to see software, you're going to see data analysis, and you're going to see real-time common operating pictures that change how incident commanders deploy and how they fight fire. That one innovation puts more tools at our disposal on a go-forward basis than we've ever had. That said, we can't become technology blind to the point where we walk past the cooperation, we walk past the innovation, we walk past cross-discipline interaction to solve this problem, because once again, if we're rolling out the door, it's already too late. Listen, nobody shares better than the fire service. And I'm really pleased to see on my panel today the kind of people that I know have spent a career sharing and cooperating. So it's my pleasure to bring forward our first panelist today, Mark Ghilarducci, who's the director of Cal OES. Director, if you'll join me on the stage, then we will start into our panel. And Chief Michael Picker, sorry, Michael, everybody in my world's a chief. Michael Picker, President of the California Public Utilities Commission. And did we have Chief Porter? Did he show up? There we go. And Chief Porter making a grand entrance from the back. Chief, I didn't even see your entire police escort bring you in here, but I'm sure they did. And Chief Porter is the director of CAL FIRE. So I think where we want to start today is I think I'll give each person an opportunity to make some opening remarks. and then we'll open the floor for questions and conversation. Welcome, Chief Porter. So with that, maybe we'll start with Michael Picker, President of California Public Utilities Commission. If you, sir, would like to make some opening remarks. Thank you.
Thanks. Is the mic working?
Yes.
Okay, great. It doesn't have a light on it, so I'm never sure. You know, this is a fairly frustrating job, and every day, usually around 2 o'clock, I open my drawer and I pull out my retirement letter. And so, Dr. Struzik, I want to tell you that you've successfully moved that time up today till about 11 a.m. So then I sit there and look at it, and I think about all the people I work with, and I realize that I have a task to do, and I buckle down and I do my job. I want to say that despite the two panelists before, the turnout here today and the amount of work that Elisa Veta-Malashenko and Rohima Mali at the CPUC, the folks at CSUS, all the other agencies who are participating with us here today gives me some hope that smart people will actually turn and focus on these issues and will make progress. So I want to thank all of you for joining us here today. We're an infrastructure agency. We essentially finance infrastructure. The infrastructure here that we focus on is the electric transmission and distribution system. And that takes electricity to people who are all across the state. It connects every building, every home, every community in the state of California. That infrastructure, the poles and wires actually provide not just electricity but telecommunications. As people move further and further and further out to get away from high cost of housing, to get away from denser populations, we see that spreading into areas that present more and more fire risk. But when I look at that, I see it in two different ways. I see the electrophysical characteristics of electricity moving through the system, places where there's resistance, places where there are population centers with demand. We don't see the landscape. The other way we look at it is as our role as a financial guarantor and auditing. Again, we don't see the landscape. We have a much different situational awareness than is called for nowadays. So I have to say that it becomes very important for us to actually build relationships with agencies who are present, who have that situational awareness, who have a understanding of the landscape and features on the landscape that interact with the infrastructure that we build. And for us at the state level, that's been CAL FIRE and the Office of Emergency Services. So the fact that we're up here together is actually emblematic of us understanding the limits of what we do at the California Public Utilities Commission and the need not to replicate what other state agencies are doing, but to leverage it, to understand it, to be good partners with them. And I'll just point to the years of work that the CPUC has done around developing with CAL FIRE wildfire fuels map that correspond to the infrastructure that we do understand and begin to develop stronger rules for managing vegetation around that infrastructure to reduce the risk of fire. The work that Coco Tomasian on our side and Mike Wilson did on CAL FIRE of coordinating our teams to build a closer, better, more realistic understanding of the challenges we face is very important. OES tends to be the agency that provides the glue that holds us all together since they have that larger situational awareness. I cannot emphasize how important it is to the future of the California Public Utilities Commission to understand that we are only a piece of all these larger puzzles and to work to be able to use the wealth and the human resources and the intellectual resources of these other agencies to actually address the challenges that Dr. Pierce was describing. So again, I point to the fact that you're all here. Smart people now are actually bringing a new force to the table, which is all of the technology developers who can help us multiply our limited human resources, our limited financial resources to begin to use these technologies to actually address these challenges and emergent trends in a faster and a more comprehensive way.
Yeah, nicely said. Thanks. Well, good morning, everyone. Great to be with you, and I'm just really so pleased to see the faces in the room and the interest in this as topic. Sort of building on what Michael talked about, you know, California really is a state of many risks and has many threats. From a natural standpoint, earthquakes and fires and floods and all of these different aspects, and probably nothing more critical to sort of an existential threat that we face than climate-related impacts. And it's wrapping itself around all of the kinds of challenge we have in being able to collectively plan for, prepare for, respond to, recover from events that are far and far more extreme, and having to be able to effectively try to mitigate or buy down that extreme risk that we all face. You know, this is a time where we have had to be challenged a great deal. All of us sitting up here as leaders at the state level, and I know dealing with our counterparts in other states and our counterparts at the federal government, and our partners in the private sector are challenged by what is the right way to be able to effectively prepare for, respond to, recover from these very traumatic events that we're seeing. And there's all these cascading, correlating issues that also apply to make the threat even more challenging. Michael mentioned utilities and power distribution, just one of many things, but has a cascading series of impacts. So while there's one focus that we're looking at, there are hundreds, sometimes thousands of cascading challenges that one needs to work through. And some of them are technical, some of them are physical, some of them are human, like dealing with demographics, individuals with access and functional needs, for example, being able to address the need, and communications, and being able to get that information out. So how do you address this? This conference really is really the right step forward. This is an all of community approach. This is not just a government approach. This is building resiliency and ability and capability by all of us together in a whole of community approach. And it's one team, one fight effort. As emergency managers, as policymakers, as fire personnel, we need to have the tools at our fingertips to be able to rapidly and effectively see what's coming at us, leverage the data, analytics, and be able to get what we need to get to make the decisions that we need to make in a time frame that saves lives and protects property. And while that may sound easy saying it, it's extremely challenging in the current environment that we face. So happy to be with you all today to talk more about this. Very excited to see you all here, and I know we'll have outcomes from this conference that will definitely help us collectively move forward.
Thank you, Mark. Thom Porter, CAL FIRE, and I'm actually going to stand because I sat in the wrong spot. I can just move. Why don't I do that? Better. Now I can see half the room. My fault on that. So, and I echo both Michael and Mark's comments about this is a team sport. This is something that we do on behalf of the state, and every one of us and those that we represent are very much a part of what you need to be considering in all the work and good work that you're doing. But we do represent, we are not the definitive people for this, but we do represent all of the emergency services and utility services on this panel. And you need to think of us in that manner. It's not just Cal OES, Cal Fire, and CPUC sitting here in front of you. So think big. We do that ourselves as we move through this landscape. And I just want to kind of frame what we're seeing from the Cal Fire fire response, fire prevention perspective. And it really, like it or not, climate change has changed the entire game for us. And all indications are we're at a point, even if we do all the good work that we're trying to do to arrest climate change in parts of the world, we're still going to have this kind of activity. And the likelihood that 2018 is the worst fire season in recorded history in California, it's likely that that's going to change too. I'm not going to say that it will change in 2019. I hope not. I hope it doesn't change for a very long time. But I believe that we're seeing conditions and seeing trends that are going to push us to more and more of these types of years that we're dealing with in the wildfire arena. And that's not all that needs to be discussed or you need to be concerned with. Wildfire is just what happens to be recently the most frequent issue that we're dealing with, and the focus of this conference. But and I'm not going to belabor, you all know how terrible the last 2 fire seasons have been for California. I'm not going to belabor that, because that truly is, I think, why there is such a huge attendance here. But I want to bring you kind of to where CAL FIRE and the fire services, those frontline emergency services that are going out to these fires, where we are. We're at a place where this is still a very boots on the ground oriented activity. We fight fire with humans on the ground and hand tools primarily. Some are squirting water, some are swinging axes and Pulaskis and McLeods. Some are driving bulldozers. But those are the individuals that are putting fires out. And so, keeping that in mind, we are nowhere near a technological solution to the human aspect here. So, my charge to you at this point in time is either work on solving that at some point down the line and understand that there's going to be union issues you're going to have to deal with, or focus on how you can help the tired, dirty, hungry firefighter who's been up for 36 hours do his or her job better. And that's really where I see us needing to move. And it's my responsibility to support the other needs of those firefighters. But if you can help us bridge a gap there, help us toward our goals of reducing fire starts, and then also, in the off-season for me, increase the ability for us to burn acres under our terms, because we do need more fuels treatment and acres burned in the state. And that's going to require us to put the fire on the ground under our terms. So those are all the things I think that you kind of need to wrap in from the fire responder kind of perspective. And with that, I think we'll go ahead and kick it back to our moderator.
Thank you very much. Excellent comments. One of the things that occurred to me as our presenters were making opening remarks is the kind of alignment that needs to happen as cross-discipline, even into industry. One of the things that has become evident this year is that there's no alignment between much of what the insurance industry is telling homeowners they need to do and what the fire community is telling residents that they need to do. The alignment of every outbound message needs to be science-based, and it needs to be based in a common outcome that helps us reduce the threat and severity of wildfire. And I think that's why we have such a cross-discipline crowd here today, is because that is going to be essential. If you have a question, please make your way toward a microphone. We have an incredible panel, and this will be your opportunity to access them. So with that, you're getting my hopes up, sir. I hope you're not headed to the restroom. Yeah.
I think this was the nearest microphone. I think I made it. So I'm Jay Mullen. I represent USAA Insurance, and I'm glad you brought up that last point because that's why I'm here today. I think in a lot of events, as a director of innovation for USAA, I've been able to go out and collaborate with the local governments, hurricanes, big events like that. But so far in California wildfires, we've been able to kind of penetrate and work in that space very little. We helped out a little bit in Butte with some 360 imagery. The Public Works group had put one of our cameras on their truck. But what I wanted to come here to do is figure out where we can best collaborate on, after the event happens. Obviously, we're not going to get in the way while the fire is burning. But once things happen, economic recovery is important. What can we do to help speed that along?
Maybe I'll take that one. First of all, let me thank you guys for all the service you provide. You've done great. Your organization has been great working with us. I would say to you that where we want you engaged, not only in the aftermath, we want you engaged on the front end. We want you engaged with us, sitting at the table, coming up with ways to help buy down the risk in the communities that we see these high-risk zones in. That could be working with us in government to maximize the way we use hazard mitigation dollars, to be able to maybe work with you and then your policyholders for incentive programs, say, for example, to maximize state or federal dollars that could work with you to partner and maybe provide grants to homeowners, to retrofit their homes to make them more resilient in the fire WUI area. It also would be sitting with you to talk about how we can leverage the resources that you bring to the table in the area of data analytics and other kinds of things to help with the demographics and be able to effectively penetrate preparedness messages into the community to make them more resilient, because this is all of us working together. And we've had some great meetings with all the insurance companies sitting at the round table since the 2017 fires, and then again after the 2018 fires. And there's some really great nuggets of opportunity there, and really would look forward to continue to work with you before. And then, of course, after the fact, that engagement with you and with us closer in the State Operations Center, representing the insurance industry to help streamline the process by which disaster aid as efficiently and effectively gets to folks that have been impacted. That's an area we could do a little improving on both of our coordination levels.
Excellent.
Yeah, I'd agree. And if I could just say, I think aligning on a loss prevention stance, and like it was mentioned, the same message needs to be from us. We give our members advice all the time. That's really what we want to do. Our mission is to facilitate financial security, and sometimes that's advice. But then on the back end, too, like the economic recovery, we noticed in a couple of events we worked with LA County. We provided some NICB aerial imagery. That's something, we're part of that consortium. If we can facilitate sharing that through the GIS platform, that's great. But also, one of the functions that I run is the drone imagery collection, and we've gone out and mapped for FEMA, the hurricanes and things like that. Sometimes that drone imagery can cut through the clouds, of smoke. It's a lot lower. We've got drones that can collect stuff, and I think in future events, if we were to work together on that, that would be better for everybody because we'd speed up the economic recovery and provide the emergency response, the data that they need with really good clarity, and we can do it. Whereas in Paradise, they did it with a bunch of smaller drones. We have larger ones and different methods to collect imagery that we'd be, excited to share.
Great, thank you. I want to make sure I connect with you before you leave.
Sure, will do.
Thank you for the question. Listen, ma'am, you next, and then we'll come over here, and then you, sir.
Hi, I'm Sashi McEntee. I'm a city council member in the city of Mill Valley in Marin County. And I'm really interested in what our previous speaker just said also, because I know we're getting to be in a code update year, and interested in what we're going to do as far as building code updates and how they align with the insurance industry. But what I wanted to ask you all was, we're really interested in alerts, and particularly alerts in an environment where we're going to have public safety power shutoffs preemptively, which could be a good thing to prevent wildfire. But how are we going to get alerts out? One, with good and timely information, and two, how are we going to get them out in the occasion of a public safety power shutoff? We are looking into long-range acoustical device sirens. We're also really big on neighborhood organizing and making sure that our neighborhoods are well connected so that people can help inform each other. And our fire chief calls this our Swiss cheese method of using multiple alert systems, each of which has holes in it, but hopefully you get something there. But all of these things require power. So we'd love to hear what you have to say on alerts and how we think about those in the future.
I'm going to start off on this, although I think we all have different ways in which we appreciate this. I think that there's a tendency, because we regulate large infrastructure utilities, to want us to require them to do a lot of the warning. And I'm just going to say that I get concerned when I hear about that, because it tends to then put a lot of information out from different sources. There is a well-established SEMS and local network under the SEMS the program, the Statewide Emergency Management System, that actually details how this ought to take place. It's not working well. It's not working well because of some challenges at the local level. It's not working well because we haven't built the utilities solidly into that system. We've kind of put them off to the side. They've stayed off to the side. They aren't whole partners in the SEMS process. But it's also because there are challenges in terms of the core technologies that we use. At this point, only about 6% of Californians actually rely primarily on landlines. Everybody else is using cell phones. Those cell phone networks fail. They also are not designed well for the emergency purposes that most people expect them to do. Different telco providers have different kinds of systems in which they track their customers. So I think that we're going to have to really buckle down and think long and hard about business as usual in terms of warning systems, or simply just saying, well, that's the utility's job. That will fail, and it'll fail as catastrophically. I think we're going to have to think long and hard about what the local role is, because you have that local knowledge. The utilities have very specific information that they use. Who is a medical baseline customer? Who is it that signed up for certain kinds of low-income assistance? That's not the right tool here. SEMS comes far closer, but the failure point continues to be the telcos. That's not something that we have the traditional legal authority to be able to provide you the kind of coverage that you want. We're going to have to think about how we get back to that kind of assurance that it's going to be there. So the second thing I'm going to say is that the people who come to us and engage in our proceedings don't know doodly about safety. They don't know anything about fire. They rarely know anything about local government. What they know is large energy utilities. This is a different kind of climate denial than we think about, and I'm guilty of it. For many years, I thought that the central task was reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the electric system and then using clean electric fuels to tackle other industries. What I'm learning over the last couple of years is we're far more advanced into climate adaptation than I had ever thought. It's here. We need to actually start to think about how we put resources into that. That's not apparent from the people who come to us and help us shape our decisions. We need to get more of you who are sitting in this room to actually come and participate. I sat through one hearing on this very question where for 30 minutes no one mentioned the core questions that were at hand. It wasn't until 30 minutes into the conversation that somebody got up and said, well, how do we know what's the best time when to deploy this public safety power shutoff? What are the tools we use to evaluate that? What will the tools be that we use to refine the utilities? Because we all know that you're not going to get to perfection in these programs at the start. We know from San Diego's experience that there was intense consternation the first couple of years, but they got better and things improved. How do we learn from that to apply that to PG&E's vastly larger territory, Southern California Edison's vastly larger? Mm-hmm. Our parties cannot answer those questions. That means the record that we base our decision on will be defective. That's one of the reasons why we reach out to these other agencies. We need to bring you folks into the process, else we will fail to provide the kind of answers that you're looking for.
Chief, would you like to comment on the emergency alerting and notification?
Well, I actually think that's probably more appropriate to Mark Ghilarducci.
Well, we're all working on it. So, well, since Michael brought up the telecoms, let me start off with that. Look, you know, alert and warning typically has been the responsibility or rests in the responsibility of local government. That's where events are evolving the fastest, and the incident commanders, the EOCs, are making decisions. However, it's been sort of a patch quilt across the state on the way you issue alert and warnings, et cetera. And we've learned that there's inconsistencies and there's also weak links. And, you know, Michael brought up one, and that is that, you know, as we go off of landlines or hardwire onto cellular networks and the way we communicate, everybody's got a cell phone, not just for alerting the public all using those, but public safety. All of us are going to that. Jeff mentioned, you know, FirstNet and getting onto this broadbanding network, which is coming together, but it's still dependent upon a single point of failure capability. And this is something that we need to think about, because we are seeing failures of the network that we are depending on time and time again, fire after fire. But it's not just here. I've talked to my colleagues in other states that have been faced with loss of their communications network in hurricanes and typhoons and tornadoes. And it talks about resiliency, that we and I challenge, I mean, this is Innovation Tech Summit, how we can build resiliency into that network to be able to get those alert and warnings out. In the coming days, we will be releasing the new alert and warning guidelines that every county and jurisdiction in the state will be needing to be following. That's going to set a standard sort of way across the state at which we're going to be doing alert and warnings. It's predicated upon a system that, you know, while there are individual companies providing alert and warning capabilities at the local level, this one was predicated on the national IPAWS WEA, Wireless Emergency Alert System. That, again, is based upon a system, a network, a pipeline that needs to be resilient. And so we're getting better there, but to Michael's point, there is still a long way to go. And I cannot imagine why, as innovative as we are in our country, that we cannot work, the telecoms and public safety and all need to come together to look at this real world issue of resiliency and capacity and reliability, so that we know when we're going to push these messages out, they're going to get out to the public in the time frames that we need to get them out there, and it's going to be something we can count on. That's different than the FirstNet, which is a much broader initiative. This is what we're talking about. I'm talking about like right in front of us today. And so to your point, Councilmember, we're on it. Those guidelines will be coming out, but there's more to do, as well as the opt-in, opt-out initiative, which is another piece of legislation that was passed, which will now require people to opt out of getting alert and warnings versus taking the time to opt in. And that's a huge difference from the years and years of the way we used to do business in the past. And that's going to help to get more message out to the public.
Sorry, just to follow up there, is the CPUC a good vehicle to convene these parties that, is it Michael? I'm sorry, was suggesting to talk about how we can create more resiliency in our cellular networks and our communication networks? Because we'd have to get FCC involved. I mean, is that something that you all would be able to do?
I think we're very hindered by the patchwork legal nature of the regulatory framework. So for some telecommunications providers by business model, they basically just come in and give us a fee and file a form every year, and then we provide them relief from local controls. They have one statewide market that they operate in, but we don't have a lot of authority over them. In other technologies, voice over internet protocol, state law prevents us from providing any direction. So we struggle with this a lot. The only place where we have the full oversight is where we set rates. And so we have lots of conversations about the best way to provide this. I'm not sure that I have a good answer for you as to how we're going to do that. I know that it's ever present on our minds.
Mm-hmm. So even if you don't have the authority, though, potentially you could convene that conversation, is what I'm wondering.
It gets very hard
You
to
can't
get
get them
people
to come
together
to
to
the
talk
table.
seriously
Yeah.
if they don't think that you have any real oversight over
Got it.
them.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for your question. Let's go here, sir.
Hi, thank you. My name is Barry Moline. I'm with the California Municipal Utilities Association. And our members serve about 25% of the state's electric needs. Fire suppression and mitigation and response and preparedness is very complex, and that's why this room is so big, and you have a lot of players in the room that are part of all those elements. For about 20 years, I was in Florida. I worked on hurricane issues, and Florida didn't do very well over the past couple of years, or at least in the early 2000s with hurricane response. And then we recognized that, decided to get together, and everybody realized that they didn't do a good job. So they sort of came to Jesus and said, let's work together and figure out how to make improvements. Sort of like where we are right now. But one thing that was missing there was someone who was in charge, somebody who was sort of the leader of at least all the players. We're trying to figure out at CMUA who's in charge, because right now we don't see who's in charge, who's leading that effort. And I would tell you that in Florida, it was OES that was in charge, a loose confederation, but somebody had to be in charge. Now, hurricanes are different from fire in that hurricanes you can't control the ignition of a hurricane, effectively. But, we do have that effort to try to minimize ignitions of fires. So in order to have a broad-based response, right now we have a lot of agencies and a lot of stakeholders that are working on this issue, but it feels like no one's in charge. And now, utilities are only 10% of the ignitions of fires, but nevertheless, some of those fires have been big. And we're looking for leadership and to coordinate with the state leaders, and we're trying to figure out who's in charge or how best to get all those stakeholders together.
So who wants to take the Alexander Haig question?
I think Michael's in charge.
Well, once again, let me offer you the calm certainty of moving all of your partner agencies under the regulatory oversight of the California Public Utilities
I
Commission.
said OES was in charge. OES. I didn't say CPUC.
You don't always get to pick your boss, Barry.
Oh, come on. Is there anybody in charge?
Well, I think you have to look at it from the standpoint that, the governor's office they're wrapping their hands around this and leading the state through that process. In that leadership role, we have the leaders of these organizations. There are many things. There are many cascading impacts, as I've said, or cascading challenges that are being tackled by all three of the organizations here and many other organizations that are sitting around the table. Depending on where we are at, we're going to be reaching out, or we need to do better to reach out, or we need to collaborate with the various stakeholders and interested parties in the various work groups that we're leading. But understand that all of this is coming together in a set of objectives and a set of requirements that are being put forth by the governor and the governor's office. So, and as the Cal Fire Director, he's doing certain key things that really fall within their statutory authority and leveraging those statutory authorities to be able to meet the objectives. So is Michael at the PUC. So am I at OES. And we're constantly together. And that's how that MOU was developed, so that the three of us, we maximize the regulatory, and then we maximize the public safety and the fire to be able to meet those objectives. It sounds to me like from your comment, you don't think it's clearly articulated who's in charge. And I don't think this is a problem where you have one person who's the czar of this problem. I think it's a collaborative approach which we all need to be involved with. And if you want to see me with regards to getting engaged in a part of it or how to do it or see one of us, we will definitely get you engaged to be part of that process.
I'm gonna push back a little bit, Barry, because I know that the traditional response of publicly owned utilities is that they don't stand under the control of any of the state's control agencies, particularly the PUC. But I also can speak from my experience of having been on the board of a publicly owned utility, as has one of my partners at the PUC. And I know that you traditionally are reluctant to come in and have conversations with us about those things that we decide. At the same time that you know that when we set a standard at the PUC, your risk managers of your individual members, your general counsels, your insurers for external insurance are going to hold you to that best practice standard. So you need to think about what are the basis on which you're willing to give up that notion of complete independence to actually do what it is that we've been forced to do, which is to actually build relationships and cede some of our independence and cede some of our traditional authority to actually giving up leadership and control to other agencies. So, for example, have you worked to actually build your local utilities into the local SEM systems? My sense is not, no, because I know that most of you work primarily through California Utility Emergency Association, which is not fully integrated. So I think you're going to have to get a little more serious about this. I really encourage you to do that because I think there's enormous value in that. I'm not trying to force local governments, local elected officials to give up their primacy in terms of control of their entities, but we cannot persist in this level of climate denial. These are overwhelming events that will force all of us to change the way that we think and behave.
So I thank you for your question. This gentleman's been patiently waiting for all the other people. I'm sorry, but we have about 6 minutes left, so we're going to have to save your question for a later panel. I apologize. Sir, the floor is yours.
Good morning. I'm David Marvin, co-founder of Salo Sciences, a new forest monitoring and analytics company. My question is for Chief Porter. You brought up a crucial point around, at least for the foreseeable future, individuals, men and women, will be on the ground fighting these fires, cutting lines. And I wanted to ask you, in your experience, what do you see as maybe the top 3 areas that need to be addressed to improve wildland firefighter safety and efficacy?
Great question, and I'm going to take you probably where you're not expecting, but actually, we as the fire services in whole, and I'm taking not only CAL FIRE, U.S. Forest Service, our other federal partners, but also our mutual aid firefighters that are coming from throughout the state, throughout the world in some cases, definitely out of state. We actually need more. It's the humans we need more of. And so I know that's not necessarily what you're all looking at, but it is the humans. We have fewer available humans to fight fire effectively than we have in the past, and we get stretched. So what does that mean? How do we extend a human's efficacy? First, for me, is more. Second is we supply them with the best possible rest and recovery they can have when they're between shifts. And then we maximize what they can do when they're out there. So we need the best possible tools that are available to them. We need the best possible intel that's available to them, real time, where the work is actually needed on a fire as opposed to maybe not. That does change throughout the day, and so real time, fine grain weather is a piece of that picture, and identifying the best use of resources, which is something that I think we've been kind of talking about in general in pieces and parts of this morning. And you're going to hear more about that from other panel members, I know. But those are the things. And while I say all of that, fire prevention, forest resiliency treatments. We need to actively manage our forests. We need to actively manage the places between our forested areas and our communities, and we need to actively enforce and the defensible space in communities and harden structures. All of these things will reduce the effects on the humans and effectively reduce the number of humans that we need to fight these fires. A Shangri-La state for me is a fire that can come from the wildland, be reduced in intensity to the point where it's a ground fire, burn through a community, not burn any infrastructure, not burn any, or hurt or kill any people, and then pass through and nothing happened except for everything's black. That's what California used to have 10,000 years ago.
Thank you, Chief. Ladies and gentlemen, as I look at this crowd and look at these experts we have up here, it reminds me as a young chief officer, an executive for a company took the stage and he was talking to a bunch of fire personnel. He said something I'll never forget. He said, if I have a leak in my roof this evening and I can call 3 roofers, I can pick the one I want. If my plumbing leaks, I can call 3 plumbers, I can pick the plumber I want. But when the thing I care most about in my life, and that's my 10-year-old daughter, when she runs into the street and is struck down by a speeding motorist, I pick up the phone, I call 911, and you know who I get? I get you. I know nothing about your competence. I know nothing about your professionalism. How dare you be anything but the best when your customer doesn't have a choice? Ladies and gentlemen, how dare we let this opportunity pass? We have public support. We have political will and momentum. There is no omnipotent czar that will tell us all what to do. What I know is the solution is this. We're going to have to cooperate and collaborate. We're going to have to give and share at levels we've never prior considered. And I hope that's the one message you take away from this panel. Thank you to our panelists today. Thank you.
All right, ladies and gentlemen. So let's see, a little bit of housekeeping. Bad news, good news. Bad news, Mr. Luck, you lost your credit card. Good news is campus police has it, so you can pick it up at their office. And I'm going to start by introducing our second panel of the morning. And our intro comments will be provided by Carolyn Wynn, Chief Operating Officer of San Diego Gas and Electric. The moderator will be Jessica Block, the Assistant Director of Wildfire Lab at the Qualcomm Institute at UC San Diego. And our panelists will be Tony Metcham, San Diego Unit Chief at CAL FIRE, Brian D'Agostino, Director of Fire Science and Climate Adaptation at San Diego Gas and Electric, Dr. Graham Kent, the Director of the Nevada Seismological Lab at the University of Nevada at Reno, and Skylar Ditchfield, CEO of GeoLinks. And Carolyn Wynn is Chief Operating Officer for San Diego Gas and Electric, one of Sempra Energy's regulated California utilities. Wynn became Chief Operating Officer of San Diego Gas and Electric in January of 2017. Previously, Wynn served as Chief Energy Delivery Officer, overseeing all energy delivery activities for San Diego Gas and Electric, including electric distribution operations and gas services, customer services, and external and state legislative affairs. Since joining the company in 1986 as an associate engineer, Wynn has held a number of leadership positions in San Diego Gas and Electric and Southern California Gas Company. And please join me in introducing. Thank you, Carolyn.
Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Caroline Wynn, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer for San Diego Gas and Electric. I am honored to be here today to share our journey, and I'm really pleased to be back at Sacramento State, where I graduated from Sacramento State with electrical engineering degrees. So it feels really good to be back, and it looks completely different than when I was here. So I'm really happy for all the expansion that has gone on here. You know, I want to first start by extending my appreciation to all the legislative leaders that are here today, all of the commissioners, all of the policymakers, all of the vendor partners, academia, and our local and state fire agencies and first responders, all who are involved in wildfire safety. Thank you for being here today. And I also want to thank all of the sponsors of today's event. I could not think of a better way to spend 2 days to share our best practices on something so important to the state of California. You know, ensuring the safety of the nearly 40 million Californians who rely on us to deliver power to their lives and businesses is something all of us in this room take very seriously. So today I want to spend my time and I want to talk about 3 things. I'll talk a lot about the lessons learned in San Diego from the 2007 wildfires. I'll talk a little bit about where we're at today and where we're moving to in the future. And I'd like to end with our thoughts about what California needs to do to mitigate the risk of climate change. You know, our journey began over a decade ago when the San Diego region experienced some of the most devastating wildfires in October of 2007. The fires at that time were among one of the most destructive in California's history. Unfortunately, there were lives that are lost, there were structures that were damaged and lost, including some that belonged to some of our employees, and 500,000 acres were scorched. There were over 500,000 evacuations that occurred, including me. Many in our company convened in our emergency operations center as soon as possible, and we worked the next 60 to 90 days to put the grid back together, developing priorities and communicating with customers. And on that day, we knew that the National Weather Service had called a red flag warning. We knew it was going to be windy. But we didn't know the magnitude of the winds. We didn't know the magnitude of the fire risks. We didn't have much information. Nobody had it at that time. At that time, there were maybe a handful of weather stations that had recorded some hourly data, but that's all we had. And those fires, I have to tell you, became a game changer for our company. No more fires, no ignitions became our rally cry across the organization. And not just in the operations area, but all the way from our frontline employees to our CEO to our holding company. We were all in alignment. And it has become the DNA of our company. And we had to shift our priorities from keeping the lights on to keeping the public safe. We did a 90-degree pivot. It became personal for all of us. We didn't have all the answers then, but we knew we had to make changes and we had to do things differently. And in the beginning, I can tell you we had a vision with a destination. That's no fires. But there wasn't a roadmap. There was no prescriptive plan that existed to tell us how to design, how to engineer, how to construct, or how to maintain our infrastructure. There was no blueprint on how to build or develop a weather network, which would later become America's largest utility weather network. But one bold decision paved a way for yet another and another, because we knew that we had the responsibility to our customers and to our employees to operate a safe and resilient grid. The belief of climate change wasn't nearly what it is today, but one thing was clear. We experienced climate conditions that we had never experienced before. And we made a decision early on. We made a decision to invest in the best and the brightest. We started with our meteorology team. And we were looking for a blend of meteorologists, data scientists, and those that had some background in fire science. One of our very first meteorologists, our very first one, is Brian DiAgostino, who's on the panel here today. 10 years ago, we hired Brian, and he is now the Director of Fire Science and Climate Adaptation for SDG&E. Steve Vandenberg was our second meteorologist. He came from the National Weather Service, where he was doing their fire modeling, and he'll be on a panel later today. And now we are 5 strong, and I have to say, I might be biased, but 5 of the best in the business. Over the years, our team has developed a very sophisticated weather monitoring network. We have around 180 weather stations throughout our service territory that are giving us near real-time information, not just about wind gusts and wind speeds, but about humidity levels, about live and dead fuel moistures. We've also been building a network of mountaintop cameras that is giving us real-time information about fires. We partnered with UCSD and the University of Nevada, Reno recently in installing these state-of-the-art cameras that I have to tell you, they've been game changers. They're able to triangulate on a smoke plume and get us exactly a lat long on where that fire started. And I can tell you that not only is it valuable to SDG&E, but also our first responders. These high-tech tools have really paid off by providing the region the type of insight and situational awareness that we didn't have in 2007. Today, we have 200,000 pieces of data that we collect daily. And our weather system is really playing a critical role in helping to inform the day-to-day operational decisions. Our team has also created something it's an index that's called the Fire Potential Index. And it takes the analysis of all of the data that I just talked about, and it gives us a daily indication of the fire risk in our different regions in our area. It's an easy green, yellow, red type index, and it is incredibly accurate, I have to tell you. What that shows you is they were able to backcast every major wildfire in San Diego, and at every major fire, you saw that fire potential index in a very elevated or extreme level. So we change our operating protocols based on our fire potential index. Twice a day, I get an email at 6 and 12:30 on the fire potential index, not just for the day, but for the next day, and sometimes a forecast for the week. We share this data with our local fire agencies, and now this data has become so incredibly accurate that they're using it to staff their own fire resources. So building the situational awareness was just one part of the tool. I would tell you that another part was hardening our infrastructure, or providing more grid resiliency so we can minimize the possibility of ignitions. Back in 2007, our system was designed to meet the CPUC General Order 95 standards. But we later found out from the meteorology data that there were many parts of our high-risk area that would exceed 56 miles. So today, our standard is 85 mile an hour and 111 mile an hour that we're designing our system. We have worked hard at replacing wood poles with steel poles, more weather-resistant steel poles. We've replaced small conductor with much larger conductor and much larger spacing between those conductors. And we're building well beyond the CPUC required standards. You know, to complement the fire hardening efforts, I mentioned that we also have our safety operating protocols that we're using. Fundamental to preventing wildfires, in our opinion, is our reclosing policy that we've established. So we turn off reclosers during the peak fire season, which now is all year long. Basically, in our high-risk area, we'll turn those off. Or we'll turn it off when we see a fire potential index in an elevated or extreme area in other parts of the territory. And by turning off these reclosers, our electric equipment, it prevents it from automatically re-energizing lines that have detected a fault. And I would say the third last piece of the puzzle is communicating and collaborating with our customers and our communities. As you can imagine, shutting off power during extreme weather conditions is not a popular thing to do. It's not a popular move. SDG&E was met with fierce opposition from the public, from the media, from our county board of supervisors when we first implemented de-energization as part of our wildfire safety mitigation program. We were the first utility to do this. People didn't understand why we had to turn off the power for public safety. But despite that harsh criticism, we stayed the course. We held town halls with the communities most impacted. We educated residents on the type of information we were getting and when we would make decisions to turn off the power. And importantly, we asked for their feedback. Tell us what we could do to help them when we get into these conditions. And from that has come our community resource centers. So nothing we did at the beginning was easy. We were making changes at a time where people were adamant that we were wrong. But the reality we knew deep down that we owe it to our customers, we owe it to our families, and we owe it to our communities to do what's right and be a safe operator of the power grid. So let me go through some of the lessons learned with you. The 2007 fires, as I said, were personal to all of us. And we took that tragedy and we turned it into action. We did not have that time the information to adequately prepare during the event, after the event. But I can tell you today, we are in a much, much better place. We learned that it's critical that you have the right people, you have the right team, you have the right skills, and you have the right priorities. We choose safety over reliability. And culture is very important. We have 4,000 employees that are aligned to our mission, and that's no fires. We also learned that you need to set high expectations for your employees. Be aspirational. I ask a lot of questions. You can ask anyone that's worked with me or around me that. I ask a lot of questions because, I want to know, what are we not thinking about? What more could we do? We also learn, and we've heard this in the previous panels, that you have to have alignment. We have alignment across our company, from our holding company to SDG&E, all the way to our frontline employees. We should also know it's not going to be easy. It wasn't easy for us at first. You'll be criticized by your customers, whether that pole, they don't like the look of the pole, it's too big, or whether they don't like the power shutoffs. It's not going to be easy at first. But we have found, I can tell you, in our last power shutoff that happened last November, we now have customers that are thanking us. We have customers that are writing letters into the newspapers thanking us. We have customers calling us in the call center. And now I can't say we have 100% alignment, but I can tell you it's significantly different than we first started. Focus also on listening and partnering with your customers and communities, and don't do it alone. I'd be remiss not to mention the tremendous impact of our partnerships with local fire safety agencies and community organizations. When our journey began, we started looking at ourselves and recognized very quickly that if we didn't have the buy-in from folks like CAL FIRE Chief Tony Meacham, if we didn't have the buy-in from former City of San Diego Fire Chief Brian Fennessy, if we didn't have the buy-in from County Board of Supervisor Ron Roberts, I am confident that we would not be where we're at today. So I can't overstate the importance of partnerships, and it's our commitment that we're going to continue to strengthen those partnerships. It took time to build that trust, and it took time to demonstrate that we all had the same goal, and that's to keep our communities safe. So let me quickly fast forward and tell you that I'm proud of the over 16,000 poles that we've replaced with steel poles. It has made a true difference in our high fire risk areas. We've completely modified our operating procedures before, during, and after a wind event. And we've also brought in one of the world's largest helitankers. We used to only keep it for the 4 peak months of the fire season, but as you know, it's all 12 months long, so it is here 24/7, 365 days a year in the San Diego region as a community asset. I can attest that the company prepares for incoming weather events, and it's not uncommon for us to start 10 days in advance, 7 days in advance. The supercomputer is running more and more and getting more confident. And at 3 days in advance, we're communicating with customers, and we're pre-patrolling targeted areas looking for any abnormalities that might cause an issue. And if we do have to do a proactive power shutoff, we 100% inspect it and patrol it before we re-energize it. And while we have some great programs that has enhanced public safety, it's important to know we're not done yet. We are not resting on our laurels. And one thing I always say is we're only as good as what we did yesterday. We're only as good as our last fire event. So what are our future plans? Well, we plan to strategically underground certain areas of our high fire risk area. That's one of the ways that we can eliminate risk in parts of our service territory. We'll also be installing something called a falling conductor algorithm. And it'll be installed on overhead lines whereby if it detects a fault, the line will de-energize before it hits the ground. We're redesigning our vegetation management program. We're doubling up on our patrols and inspections in the high fire risk area. And we're also going to a 25-foot post-trim clear where possible, and a 100% audit of that vegetation management area. We're also going to leverage the use of artificial intelligence, taking all of that weather data, taking all of the vegetation management data. So tens of millions of data points, and I think it could differentially continue to progress our program. We're going to accelerate our system hardening programs in our high-risk fire area. Our wood to steel. We're redesigning the grid in our Cleveland National Forest. And lastly, we're going to be replicating our programs in the areas on the fringes of the high fire risk area, I guess better known as the wildland urban interface area. I think someone called it a WUI. I didn't know that. So I thought it's only utility people that use those acronyms. But we're going to be replicating those programs in those fringe areas, including the expansion of weather stations and cameras on our system. My last point is this, that California's wildfire risk has increased significantly in recent years. We've heard that earlier. 8 of the 20 most destructive fires in California's history occurred in 2017 and 2018. Electric utilities play a key role in helping our state meet its ambitious climate change goals. So given this essential role of the utilities, the investor-owned utilities need to remain financially attractive to the capital market so that we can keep that going. I know everyone in this room wants to see proof that progress is being made and that we are being held accountable and making our communities safe. And we agree with that. SDG&E and other utilities filed their wildfire mitigation plans last month. But a key question that's needed as part of that approval of these plans is, if we have substantially complied with the plans, will the commission deem us as a prudent operator for purposes of cost recovery? We depend on those capital markets to do routine investments and investments to enhance the wildfire mitigation plans and investments. And investing in a way which we can stay ahead of the challenges of climate change will become increasingly difficult if capital is hard to access or impossible to access. So I'm going to conclude. I want to stress again that we know our work to mitigate wildfire risk is not over. Our commitment to our customer safety is unwavering. We will continue to improve every day, installing steel poles, undergrounding power lines, aggressively trimming vegetation, and we're going to continue to work with state leaders, regulators, and agencies to help identify and implement the right solutions that will adequately address wildfire risks. The recent series of credit downgrades on energy companies, including San Diego Gas and Electric, really highlights the need to urgently address the framework surrounding wildfire mitigations. And ultimately, everyone who depends on energy to power their daily lives could be hurt. So no matter what the future holds, there will never be a higher priority to us than safety of our communities. And we're going to ensure that innovation and technology are there and ensure that we are better than we were yesterday. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Jessica Block. I'm the Assistant Director for the Wildfire Lab at UC San Diego, and I am pleased to introduce this second opening panel for the morning about lessons learned in San Diego. To echo Caroline's points, there's a lot that San Diego has experienced to get ahead of the conversation that we're having here. Before the 2007 fires, there was the 2003 Cedar Fire, which was the largest fire in California history until the Thomas Fire in 2017. And because the 2007 fires were only 4 years later, which was unprecedented at the time, there was a voluntary evacuation of 500,000 people in the county, which was unprecedented at the time. These events motivated the need to get ahead of the issue. SDG&E built their meteorology team and started installing their own weather network. This enabled better understanding of local weather and the build-out of a complex daily scientific workflow. San Diego State University, in partnership with Google in 2007, built out the first web map that had up-to-date fire perimeters. That was the first of its kind. And the 2007 fires were also used, and the 2003 fires were used the UC San Diego High Performance Wireless Research and Education Network, also known as HPREN, which had mountaintop cameras that were stationary, which were, to some in the backcountry, the only intelligence that they knew of where the fires were. So there was a lot of innovation that's being talked about over the next 2 days that was first developed in San Diego. Our panelists here are representing different pieces of this community of people and technology, and we're hoping to work to talk about working together to keep San Diego County safe. So I'd like to introduce the panelists. First is Chief Tony Meacham from this San Diego. He's the San Diego Unit Chief for CAL FIRE. Brian D'Agostino is the Director of the Fire Science and Climate Adaptation at San Diego Gas and Electric. Graham Kent is the Director of the Nevada Seismological Lab at the University of Nevada, Reno. And Skylar Ditchfield is the CEO of GeoLinks. So I'll kick it off with Chief Meacham. Yes, do you want to stand or do you want to sit?
I'll sit here, I guess.
Okay.
Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. Let me get this going. So my perspective on this is having worked in San Diego most of my career and being there during the 2003 fires, and then only having my home evacuated in 2007, but being one of the commanders of the Harris Fire. And the Harris Fire was a particularly tough afternoon. That first afternoon, we flew out 22 critically injured people that had been burned, and I was one of the commanders that made the decision to issue the evacuation order for nearly 250,000 people. And kind of my very short PowerPoint is, what I've learned is it takes a village to solve this fire problem, and that's why I'm here today. So I would argue that California has always had large fires. If you go back and look at the 1970 Laguna Fire or some of these others, we've always had large fires. We've also had large damaging fires. If you look at the Paint Fire in the Santa Barbara Front Country, over 400 homes. So we've had this fire problem. But what we saw in 2003 in San Diego was what I would call the first mega fire, and that is that fire that was not only large in acreage, but very large in damaging. And it really shocked most of us. Most of us in the fire business could not get our arms around what we were seeing with that fire. The sheer rate of spread, particularly that first evening, we had never seen that before. And so I think a lot of us kind of chalked it up as, hey, this is a once-in-a-lifetime event. And then shortly after that, we got hit with 2007 fires. And that was really the reality for us that set in 2007 that, hey, things are changing, and you know the history from 2007 until now. This is a graphical look at our fire history in San Diego County from 1980 to 1990. This was what fire seasons had looked like historically. Yes, we had fires, 5,000, 10,000 acre fires, and we've always had a wildland problem. But then look at the difference we see starting in 2000, between 2000 and 2017, when we've had over half of the county burn. And it becomes a little more clear when you look at the 2003 fires. We talk a lot about the Cedar Fire, but we forget in the North County, we had the Paradise Fire, a very large fire, and down along the border, we had the Otay Fire. So we had 3 major fires in San Diego County in a very short period of time. That was subsequently repeated in 2007 with the Harris, the Witch, the Wahita, and the Pumacha Fire, and 3 of those fires merged. We also had a very large fire in Camp Pendleton. So kind of what we got out of that, or what we've had, is we've had 16 years to go back and look at our fire problem. And after 2017, we had a delegation from Sonoma County came down and talked to us about some of our collective experience. So these are a few of the things that I want to talk about. We've still had large fires. In May of 2014, we had kind of an unusual Santa Ana wind event. Again, these were primarily more towards the coastal areas, but we had 7 major fires start in one day in San Diego, and we've had numerous large fires from there. And so these, and I'm really going to speak at kind of a high level because I think Brian and some of the panelists can probably answer the technical details, but I want to paint the picture. Is the first thing that we've learned is that wildland fires have become a community event or a community disaster. When I started, we went out, we put out wildland fires, we kind of did our thing, but now we are seeing those impacts to communities. The economic loss is measured in the billions of dollars. And when you think about disrupting with thousands of people homeless and businesses and the infrastructure, those costs climb exponentially. As good as we are, and I agree with Chief Porter that we are short firefighters and we need more firefighters, we are not going to put out every fire in California. And certainly when the Santa Ana winds blow, we're not going to put all of those fires out. And so it really takes this kind of village approach. The first thing that I would articulate is interagency cooperation is a must.
Caroline and Brian and Tom Geyer and these people from SDG&E specifically, I'm on a first-name basis. We talk. We're in each other's offices all the time. We've realized that our public health departments, not only the evacuation, but the smoke issues with our elderly and people that have health issues, infrastructure, trying to get people back to work, everything that Mark Ghilarducci and our local and state OES do are critically involved. This is not just a firefighting problem. We recognize that we have to look at more of a regional approach. The one fire department, even as large as the state and federal fire departments are, we're not large enough to handle this. So we have to approach things from a regional perspective. I've already talked about it's not just a fire problem. We have a lot of non-traditional partners. When I became the fire chief, if they said, hey, chief, you're going to be spending a lot of time at Scripps Institute at UCSD talking with academic researchers, that's been a surprise to me. But I found some partnerships with people that have the ability to bring solutions to us that I never knew about that. So we, as a fire service, have had to open our horizon, and if I look across this room and look to all of you to help us solve this problem. We're becoming much more dependent on technology and data. We live in that world. I'll talk kind of at the end if there's any questions about the HP RAN or some of the cameras and some of the things we're using. But we are dependent on information and technology. The rate of spread that we're seeing on these fires has outpaced, in my opinion, almost our human mind's ability to keep up, and we're going to continue to depend on that. We have to have the expansion of these services into rural areas. We cannot have fires that start in rural areas that are a threat to the city and not have that technology and that connectivity available to us very early on, because the decisions that we're making in that first hour of our incidents ultimately may be affecting communities 2, 3, 4 hours later. We have to really, what I would call, front load that data so that we can make better decisions and look at the totality of the problem within really probably the first 30 minutes of the incident. Situational awareness is something else that we've gained. Certainly in San Diego, when you take, in 2007, 4 Type 1 incident management teams in the county. On any given day, a Type 1 team coming in as a major incident, to have 4 of those and to try and allocate resources and keep abreast of what's going on is extremely difficult without some way of meshing all of that technology and giving, or that information and giving it to it. Cameras and real-time intelligence, and I think I'll come back to that at the end. Standardized evacuation procedures. There was a question in the earlier presentation about that. We, as a region with local funding and partnering with our Sheriff's Department, developed a countywide grid system. We trained approximately 7,000 first responders, all police and fire in San Diego, to use the same evacuation terminology and grid. And we're currently working on a project where I can take that map, grid it, and off of an iPad or a mobile device, simply push a button on what square I want to evacuate. That would be seen at the Sheriff's Communication Center, and they would be able to push those evacuation notices almost in real time compared to the old way that we have to do that. So I think that we need to continue to look at how are we going to get people out of harm's way. Weather data. And I know Thom Rolinski's here. I got to give Thom a shout out for the Santa Ana Wind Threat Index. As government agencies, we're spending millions of dollars of the taxpayers' money, and the amount of weather data that we're collecting and putting that into a usable format allows somebody like me to make decisions of when do we bring extra resources on, when do I hold people on duty, so that that reliance to looking at data and trying to anticipate the event. And then finally, where we need to go is we have to address this wildland fire problem before it occurs. And that is in fire-adapted communities, looking at how we're developing, where we're building homes, how we're building homes, what are we going to do to the landscape, how are we going to look at long-term fuel modifications. Because the harsh reality, and I tell everybody, is you are not going to have a fire engine at everybody's home. And so with that, I'm going to kind of turn it back to the panel. What we've seen is these fires that started in 2003, and then the people up here have brought some of these technical solutions that we literally use every day. Thank you.
All right, well, good morning, everybody. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here, and my thanks to all the organizers and Jessica for really giving the opportunity to get into a little bit more of the details. Part of what I'll be doing here this morning is building on what Caroline shared and really talking about the situational awareness platform that we have. And then in addition, building also on more technology demonstrations that you'll be seeing throughout the course of the afternoon. I think at this point it'd be a great time to queue up and hit play on the video, and then we will talk through this. What we're looking at is a portion of San Diego's backcountry. And this is actually in our highest risk fire areas. Some of the areas that hosted these mega fires, which we've heard about in 2003 and 2007, we just overlaid some of the infrastructure of the distribution lines in San Diego. And if we went back to 2007, there was not a lot of weather information available. As we know, we had Ramona, which is about 1,500 feet above sea level, and that gave us some weather information. But then we had to travel all the way up to Julian, which is almost 4,000 feet above sea level, 20 miles up into the mountains. And the reality is that there's lots of weather happening in between. So if we fast forward to today, what you just saw was this is what we know today. Every number up there is where we own and operate a weather station, and it gives us the information that we need. And this is extremely valuable for many reasons, but one that I'm going to highlight now is weather modeling. We can now come in and with all of this information, not only across this area of Ramona, but as you zoom out across San Diego, we have it all across our service territory now, over 175 of these weather stations. This enables us to validate and calibrate very high resolution weather modeling. So what you've seen just come on the map, this is output from our high resolution weather modeling. Those red areas that you're seeing are places where wind gusts are forecast to exceed 35 miles per hour. And we can now move through hour by hour and get very granular information that can be fed to our emergency operations centers and also fed to our day-to-day decision makers all across San Diego. And as we zoom in a little further, you can see how we now understand how these winds interact with our terrain. And you can see the strongest winds may be just along the top of the mountain. And now we understand where the strongest winds are interacting with our electric system. And then this is information that's very valuable. But weather is one piece of this. And as you heard Caroline mention this morning, the fire potential index was something that we needed. How this system was actually originally developed, the head of our fire coordination group walked into the Weather Center in 2011, and he said, we need to understand and communicate to everybody in this company what is the fire danger 365 days a year. So we went in and we looked at what are the major drivers of wildfire that we have in San Diego. And of course, the weather is a big one, but then also the fuels. That is a major component, and how much moisture is in those fuels. So we look originally at the grasses. Grass is very important. We've developed a system, which you're going to hear a lot about this afternoon from Steve Vanderberg, where we use satellite to monitor the grasses, high performance computing to monitor the dead fuels, and then live fuels are also extremely important, and something you're going to hear this afternoon from Atmospheric Data Solutions is really very innovative ways looking at artificial intelligence to move that area of modeling forward. But there was an algorithm that was then developed. When all of these factors are lined up against us, and this is something that Caroline alluded to in her discussion this morning, we were able to predict everywhere where we had historically seen these mega fires and large fire activity in San Diego. We've been running this operationally since 2012 and providing it for all 8 districts that we have at SDG&E and providing that every day. And it's really been a game changer in terms of the situational awareness that we need to anticipate and prepare for these events. Having a week and seeing them coming is extremely valuable. But what we did see is there was still one gap that we really needed to fill. And this is where we started collaborating very closely with Thom at the time at the U.S. Forest Service and Predictive Services, and also UCLA. And what it was is we needed to understand how severe an event was when it's coming. And Chief Meacham, thank you for mentioning SATI, the Santa Ana Wildfire Threat Index, because what it is for us in Southern California is just like the hurricane has a scale to rate whether it's Category 1 to Category 5, the SATI rates the severity of these Santa Ana winds from marginal to extreme. And just like you would prepare for a Category 1 very differently than you would a Category 5, we will do the same for Santa Ana winds. So the graph you see up there now displays a lot of the analysis that went into developing this index. It was actually over 30 terabytes of information that went into this graph, but it rates the fire potential every day going back to 1984. And what you can see is whether you have an event where the day just peaks up into the yellow or it peaks all the way up into the purple, both of those days are red flag warnings. But it becomes extremely important in your ability to anticipate and prepare to understand the magnitude of these events. And in particular, we knew coming into 2017 and 2018 in San Diego that we were dealing with top 3 events in the last 35 years, meaning we had not seen riskier events. The only one day in the last 35 years were riskier than that, and we knew that coming into it, which was absolutely critical. I mentioned there's a tremendous amount of data being generated as part of the Wildfire Threat Index. Well, this gave a unique opportunity in San Diego to build our wildfire risk reduction modeling. With all of this information, we now have a system that automatically generates over 10 million virtual wildfires all across our service territory every day. What's looping now is the wildfire risk this winter. There's been lots of rain. You'll notice a few colors on the map showing where we could see up to a 1-acre fire if we didn't suppress it. But it's truly a big data application that gives us this type of application. But if we actually go back, and we'll start to load up some historical data to look back at the very tail end of the last fire season, because we're able to archive all of our historical information from this. So we're actually going back to November of last year, and then we go through the process of loading this, and we're not just loading the wind information and relative humidity, but also what are the 1-hour fuels, the 10-hour fuels, what is the live fuel moisture, and we're getting all this information archived on a 2-kilometer grid, which we heard earlier, and running it out. And now you can see, as we load this, areas on the map you see behind me that has those areas of red are actually areas where our models project a fire that comes out of that area that grows unsuppressed for the next 8 hours will exceed 2,500 acres. So whereas a red flag warning can cover the whole region, we've been able to really hone in on what are the highest risk areas. And this becomes very critical information in our emergency operations center as we can start to understand where on the landscape itself is the highest risk over the next day and 2 days, because we can really target our resources to mitigate that risk when we start to understand it at this level. The other capability that we have with this system that's going to be demonstrated in much greater detail this afternoon by Techno Silva is that we can simulate virtual wildfires. So if you head in on the landscape and we get a call or we identify from the mountaintop camera network that there is a fire on the landscape and we triangulate it and we pick the spot, we could say, okay, based off all the current information we have from our models with weather and fuels, how do we anticipate this fire is going to grow over the next few hours? So what the system does now is you go in and you pick your location, and it's taking what is the moisture content in the live fuel, what is the moisture content in the dead fuel, What are we actually going to see the weather do? Because if we see a wind shift in 2 or 3 hours, we'd expect that fire to turn. This system has the capability to do all of that. And then it can come in and it shows us what do we expect this fire to look like? How are we going to see it grow? And then from there, we can look at it. This is very custom built right now for utility operations. So it can tell us how many poles could potentially be impacted, how many power lines could potentially be impacted, how many houses, residences. So a very valuable tool. I'm going to help tee up Graham's talk here as well and show the Alert SDG&E camera network. This is really a collaboration between CAL FIRE, SDG&E, the HP REN network at UCSD, and Graham at University of Nevada in Reno. And SDG&E's Emergency Operations Center has access to these cameras, but also so does Chief Meacham and his captains, where if there's any fire on the landscape, we quickly zoom in. We can hone in on any incident, and we do this from multiple mountaintops. And when you do it from multiple mountaintops, you heard Caroline talk about how we can triangulate exactly where an incident is. You can see here now demonstrated that we know exactly where on the landscape we have any incident that can come up. And as we head through the remainder of the day, I know this is just to tee up. We're going to hear from lots of the experts to get a much deeper dive into each of these technologies, but really appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I'll hand it back to Jessica.
Graham, do you want to come up?
Great. Yeah, thank you for having me here. And to Carolyn Wynn and everybody for the kind words about at least one of the game changers with Alert Wildfire. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. But first, I'd like to highlight the fact that we're all in here because we have a story, right? Otherwise, we'd be somewhere else. And my story, my family's story, is in 2003, I lived in Tierra Santa. And then we were burned over by the Cedar Fire. The Cedar Fire was supposed to be back at Highway 67, and yet it already jumped across 805. I'm a seismologist, right? People involved with these early fire camera networks, we're all seismologists. And we're still seismologists, and we do multi-hazard, right? But we learned in 2003 that there were some web cameras up on the HP REN network, and they were providing great information. Unfortunately, we got more opportunities to test it. And what we started to think was, well, we shouldn't have to have a 200,000 acre fire or a fire close to a mountaintop to go out and hunt the fire, to get it when it's small, to knock it down when it's small. And that is where Alert Tahoe came in, which born into Alert Wildfire that I'll talk to for about the next 10 minutes. And again, the village thing, I'm up here in front of everybody representing Alert Wildfire and the team and everybody else we deal with, including everyone up on the tower here, up on the stage. I just talk about towers, really. What is Alert Wildfire? Really what we're trying to do is put, again, cameras out in the wildland, sometimes in the wildland urban interface. We're doing a pretty good job. We're out in 5 states, but we want to have these near-infrared, high-definition, pan-tilt zoom cameras available to the people that need to move it. We want that on-demand time-lapse, because that's really good for hunting for fires and understanding fire behavior, because some of the people on the stage here actually run towards the fire. I don't do that. We want the public invited in. So we have that public website, which will be changing tomorrow, hint, and you'll see a lot of changes over the next month. But it's up on Amazon Web Services S3 bucket, so we can infinitely scale. We can have 1 million people jump on if there's a Bel Air fire, and it won't go down. Unfortunately, we're seeing a lot of late season fires, so for those areas where we don't have hard power, we have to start doing some fancy power management, because we have to be able to turn that camera back on in December. And again, it needs to work on not just that dispatch, it needs to work on your cell phone. You know, Chief Nichols out of St. Helena was moving cameras on an airplane this year. Think about that. And again, over the last 3 years, we've been involved with over 600 fires. And what I also want to say is, well more than that, controlled burns, prescribed burns, because we have that other problem. So obviously, when they do that during the seasons where that's allowable, we got to track smoke for health reasons and whatnot. So here's the alert wildfire footprint. Again, we're in 5 states now? It keeps growing. And it's a consortium between 3 universities at the University of Nevada, Reno, UC San Diego, and University of Oregon. So we're playing with ducks, not parachuting beavers. So it really started in 2013 in Lake Tahoe, and we got early funding from an NGO, the Tahoe Prosperity Center. And it started to grow with help from the Forest Service, BLM. But in 2017, we got to work with SDG&E, and we had a lot of success we'll talk about in a minute. But here's the deal. You know, I've lived a big chunk of my life in San Diego, and it's a beautiful place, but we want this technology everywhere, not just in San Diego. So how are we going to do that? Well, recently, we're also working with Southern California Edison and Pacific Gas and Electric, counties all throughout California. And the idea is, how do we scale up? How do we get these cameras out? You know, we only had about 80 cameras 3 or 4 months ago, and we're soon going to be at nearly 200. And that's getting creative. We talked about that triangle, and we put politics in there. There's also bureaucracy. How do we get around bureaucracy? So we've worked with GeoLinks to learn how to scale. So Skylar will be up here after me to talk about how do you scale up? How do you get these things out? And again, like I said, over the last 2.5 months, we put up 100 cameras. So here's an example of a fire in the Tahoe Basin from about 19 miles to look at the quality of the near-infrared cameras. And this is a big old tree about yay big, broke in 70-mile-an-hour winds. The fire's just starting. It's about 2 or 3 minutes, about 5 minutes into the fire. Nighttime sometimes a challenge, not with near-infrared. In fact, it's really easy. In the basin and range after a lightning fire, we go out there and just start picking them off. So no longer nighttime doesn't have to be a hard time to find fires. Again, as Brian talked about, we want to provide that ability to quickly triangulate to the fire, and this is a fire just west of Escondido. Again, you could do this from dispatch with Chief Meacham's Monte Vista. You could also do it on your iPhone somewhere in Paris, France. So it's available to everybody, not to move, but to understand your situational awareness. So how does this work? So one of the examples I think we all would agree here is the success during the Lilac Fire. And again, this was one of the worst fire condition days in San Diego history. And we were all going back and forth, and we were all very worried, right? So how's this going to work out? Well, unfortunately, there was a car fire or a fire off of Old Highway 395 north of Escondido. And this is just looking at the public interface if you haven't been to alertwildfire.org. And there's a whole bunch of different cameras at the bottom, and you can just click it, pick your camera. You see the camera you want up there in larger view. You can see the map over to the upper right, and that shows you the view shed, or as Brian highlighted, you could actually locate it. But it allows not just folks in Monte Vista or anywhere else in some ECC, but the public can jump on it, and they did. We served up about 1/3 of a terabyte of data in 12 hours. And we also want to highlight there are programs going around now in California where folks are volunteering to be fire watchers during fire-prone periods of time, like in Orange County. So what we're really are doing is crowdsourcing the 21st Century Fire Lookout. So we want everybody involved. It doesn't matter whether if it's artificial intelligence, machine vision, it doesn't matter if it's crowdsourcing or they see at the ECC. We need to get on these fires quickly. And when we do that, folks like Chief Meacham can make a better decision, right? Who's failed the geography test here, right? I don't know where's Pine Mountain, Geyser Peak? This happened in Sonoma County where some citizen did her or his duty to call in the fire. It was 15 miles away from where they called it in because they didn't know the difference between Pine Mountain and Geyser Peak. Well, guess what? Normally that would cause some problems, as Chief Beecham would know, right? But in this case, Shannon Chris just jumped from the Pine Mountain camera where he didn't see anything down to Geyser Peak, and within a minute they knew about the mistake and responded properly. So we need to learn how to do that. Now, I always tease Captain Corey Costa here because they only had these cameras for about 2 months when the lilac broke out. And I figured, I was like, Corey, how did you point that camera so quickly at that little wispy bit of smoke? And he says, well, my mom lives about a quarter mile to upwind. I said, okay, I understand. But there allows the chief to make a decision that he was able to make because he could see the rest of the county to realize this is a bad situation getting worse, but I don't see anything elsewhere, okay? And that's just one of the many ways of trying to do a better job on handling scaling. Now, there were 4 different cameras on this fire, and hopefully this will, hello, there we go. And this is a super duper time lapse, but this fire was being watched from 4 different camera angles. And in a little bit, you'll see a smoke plume in the back pop up from across the Mexican border. And so that was another situation where they realized it wasn't in California and they didn't have to pull people off the fire. If you notice at the bottom, there's a text line that allows you to know who's moving the cameras, how long since they moved it last. That allows people to better understand what's going on at Monte Vista in this case, or potentially South Ops who are watching this. So, right, nearly a year later, we had this mountain wave, this bad Santa Ana, and it was already causing, obviously, damages as it slid down the state. And here's an example of a house fire that luckily didn't escape. And again, one of the things I want to point out is it's not just the cameras, it's not just the fire modeling, it's not the bravery of your folks, right? It's not having that sky crane helicopter out there. It's kind of like a ballet. And what San Diego County has learned how to do is do that dance better than anybody. So let's look at the dance. And it's quick. And in comes the sky crane helicopter, and then come the fire trucks. You missed it, right? Let's do it one more time. This won't always be possible. It doesn't always work out that good. One of the things we don't want you to come away from this is go, wow, the Geek Squad's going to solve everything, right? But we don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good. So what we need to do is get very good at doing this. But again, every fire also has a story, just like you all have your story. And I'll give you one more story before they kick me off the stage. This was an arson spree near South Lake Tahoe in 2016. And the arsonist lit over 24 fires. And we were able to, with the network up at Alert Tahoe, essentially provide the firefighters, and I know a few of you are in there, we were able to not only discover many, confirm some other ones, because I'd get one of the fire battalion chiefs from South Lake Tahoe Fire saying, we're at Pioneer and El Tahoe, and it's not here. So we'd get up there and go, it's 3 miles to the north, to the east. And so we were able to do that. None of these fires escaped. And that was a good sense, again, of the dance. Now, here's an interesting fire that I showed you a little while ago from the broken tree. That's the emerald fire in the background. Not a good situation. The rain was supposed to come around midnight when they de-escalated forces. The rain came 3 hours late, right? The other person late to the party, unfortunately, was our arsonist, right? So I want you to look below the emerald fire and let's see what happens. This is not in a good situation. It's in a meadow, and downwind are a bunch of homes. And there it goes. What the arsonist probably didn't realize, he lit it right in front of the camera view that everybody was watching. So again, another way of getting a victory out of a day that was tough for everybody. One of the things that we all kind of talked about this village is if you just look at the Rolodex from doing some work in Sonoma County, I don't know if Senator Dodd's still here, but I feel like I'm already a citizen of your county. dozens and dozens of people we interact just to get some fire cameras in. This is a lesson that Skylar has to deal with every day to get our points of presence. And we got to do that fast, right? But then we need to have the support from everybody who's providing financial support. And there's a list there that I've already talked about, right? And then again, there's folks like Skylar, Ditchfield, and Geolinks that's helping us get literally 100 cameras out in the last 2.5 months. That's exciting. I'll just leave you with this. I know you've seen a lot of rain in Sonoma, and it's been, things are starting to grow and pop up, and lo and behold, a fire camera just popped up on the top of Pepperwood, and that's Mount St. Helena in the background. So thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Graham, for the word. So our company is Geolinks, and we are a fixed wireless telecommunications company, operate the largest fixed wireless network in the state of California. In 2017, the Thomas Fire burned 70% of my neighborhood and my home. And I was at the Scenic Conference not too long after that, and there was a big topic on wildfires. And I said, wow, I didn't realize all these systems were out there. I didn't realize what had been done so amazingly in the San Diego area, not to mention the modeling systems that were out there. And I wondered, why didn't we have better coverage of this? This was a proven model and a proven system. And it was something that I started thinking, how can we utilize our assets that already exist and our field teams to help scale this up? So quickly about us, we are a CLEC in the state of California. We operate all across the state in terms of network assets, north to south, east to west. A lot of business to business. But what came out of that conference last year was a partnership between CNIC, which is the Research and Educational Network that connects 97% of the K-12 schools, the UC systems, the junior colleges, and the research institutions across the state, was an idea to use their fiber backbone that's statewide that already exists, and then build an extension of our fixed wireless network in a mesh design that is resilient not only to wildfires but other disasters, and utilize that to bring in the technology of the camera systems, the weather stations, and any other data collection sensors and other data communications facilities and technologies to enable what has happened in San Diego here across the state. Here's a quick picture of one of our guys installing wildfire cameras just a month or so ago. Like Graham said, through the partnership that we've developed, which has been in collaboration with their team, has been really great. We've been able to put out more cameras, I think, in the last 4 months than we're done in, 4 or 5 years previously. But again, we're just scratching the surface. We need to get this statewide and a ubiquitous coverage model with the ability for triangulation. We've been working on I'll back up one there, a model of building systems that are not only where traditional comm sites are, like the ones you see here, but we've built over 100 solar-powered and wind-powered facilities in very remote and rural locations. A lot of that was to reach rural schools, libraries, and other institutions. And through that work, we really developed a system where we can scale rapidly, building modular systems that can reach areas that don't have existing grid power or existing facilities. In that model, we started collecting data from regional fire people and other agencies of what would be the most beneficial way. So if you look at what we want to put forward is using the fiber optic backbone of Scenic that's out there. There's one of our guys on the top of the tower that I wouldn't climb that high, but and enable everything that's needed. So what we started hearing back was more camera systems, more weather stations, more connectivity. Two-way radio systems have blackouts and need repeater trucks that come out in the rural areas. Cell sites that are out in those rural areas are either not available or overloaded quickly by 2,000 to 3,000 fire personnel in those areas. So by building this network, we can have small little tripod-based systems that can be put out very quickly, that can create hotspots with up to a gigabit of access in those areas to support the fire teams in the rural areas can supplement access or completely replace access where cellular has failed or is overloaded. We can close the two-way radio connectivity gap and ultimately bring all the data back that is needed for the modeling, for the situational awareness, and push that out. This is an example of a very small, tiny footprint solar-powered unit, kind of like the one Graham showed earlier in Sonoma. We've got these units that we build modularly, can put up, and we can use existing state assets like CAL FIRE lookout posts and locations. We've built a lot of distributed antenna arrays. There's one with a little bit of wind power on it. Get to a couple examples here. Some very tough weather conditions we've learned to deal with, snow, etc. Ability to keep power in 3 to 4 weeks of storms. So we've done all the weather modeling 50 years back in California for the resiliency part. These are some of our teams working on extremely remote sites. So again, resiliency was one of the key points earlier. I was added to, by the request of Chairman Pai, a working group of the FCC a few months ago for the disaster recovery and relief. I was charged with specifically how do we get broadband providers to coordinate better in the event of a disaster, after a disaster, and before a disaster. And that's a tough thing to do. As we know, a lot of companies, whether it's cellular or other broadband providers, don't work well together. So how do we come together before a disaster? Because afterwards, we're now reacting after the fact. One of the ideas we had when putting the model for this network together was this network is going to have times of peak usage during fires where it's streaming lots of data. It's going to have lots of times of downtime. And there'll be segments of the network in this mesh design that have less traffic or more traffic. And with prioritization of that data, what we can do potentially is, with the cooperation of cellular providers, is we could provide microwave connections to all the existing cellular towers as well. And in the event that their primary connections go down, it could be offloaded onto this state network that would ultimately hit scenic and then be pushed back and allow these sites to stay up. This would save many hours or days before truck-based systems come in and alleviate down systems or overloaded systems. This is a quick picture here of one of our systems that's over Pomona, if I remember correctly. And we did a distributed antenna array. So a lot of our stuff is not the big comm towers that you see. This is all painted to match. The solar panels are pushed back out of the view shed. You see there's a camo paint on the antenna array, and this is a bigger antenna array than would typically be used in this type of an application. This serves a number, about 200 endpoints. But when you get 70 to 100 feet back from this, you can't see it at all. So visually, not obtrusive, environmentally, not impactful, and just wanted to commend the work that's been done by SG&E, Alert Wildfire, HP-REN, and all these other groups that have been involved in this. So now it's really not does this work, this has been proven to work, it's how fast do we get it out there. And we've worked on a shovel-ready plan with Scenic that could have a statewide coverage when a model fully funded and built out in 18 months. Thank you.
So I think we only have about 10 minutes left. So if anybody has any questions, please feel free to come to the mics. And while people are assembling, I'd like to ask Brian and Chief Meacham a sort of collaborative question. We always talk about these worst case scenarios that we remember, but can you speak to the nature of your collaboration and how that works, and maybe speak to some success stories and or discoveries?
I'm going to come up to, I apologize this side of the room when I sat down earlier. So kind of three things that I really wanted to emphasize. I go down and talk to Brian in his fishbowl, and he starts talking and loses me. And where they're going on fire modeling, I said, hey, Brian, wouldn't it be a great tool if, and when we get a fire, we're very, very busy in that first half hour, trying to deploy resources and do these things. I said, hey, if you could take that fire modeling and almost like a PDF or snapshot something to a cell phone to my fire commanders. And so we've started having those discussions. But I think we really have two great success stories in the San Diego. And the first one was the Lilac Fire. And I go back to Thom and SDG&E and all the work that was done with the Santa Ana Wind Threat Index. On that particular day, the threat level rose to purple. And when you look historically at purple days in San Diego, that is the Cedar Fire, that is the Witch-type fire. So we knew about 4 days ahead of time this was coming on. Not only did we up staff, But again, I talked about the village. I'm really fortunate that in my county, all of my fire chief partners, we look at this problem collectively. We had brought on about 30 additional engine companies, and we had held staff on. So when we get a fire with cell phones now, it's not uncommon for us to get 300-400 phone calls overloading the 911 system. So when you get bogged down on that phone system, you can lose track of that. So we are the control point for San Diego County for those cameras, point-two zoom cameras. So we were able to look at the Lilac fire, our captain was, who was not on the 911, realized right away that we had a well-established fire in one of our major wind-prone tunnels along the Highway 76 corridor, and we immediately augmented. And I think this is a pretty phenomenal number, that in the first 3 minutes, we put 40 fire engines on the road in the first 3 minutes going to that. Fast forward to this summer, our second success story I wanted to share with you was July 6th of this year. A little unusual. It was a very hot, dry, windy, very westerly, very dry wind. We saw this coming that morning. I was actually at home. We had a fire down in South County in the community of Delzura, rapidly expanding, structures involved. We started augmenting. I pulled up the cameras. I started listening to the radio thinking, hey, this is when I might need to go back into work. And luckily, we got our arms around that fire. But as we were just starting to get our arms around that, we started getting phone calls from the community of Alpine for the West Fire. Our dispatchers, and I was at home, I literally watched on my computer at home, I watched our dispatch center turn the cameras, point it to Alpine, and we realized we have a big problem. All of the additional aircraft that we had already ordered that was on its way down from Riverside, we diverted that aircraft real time in flight to the West Fire because we could see it. Ultimately, that fire burned 565 acres and destroyed 38 structures. But when the first engine company arrived, we had fire actively burning in a senior trailer park and an imminent life threat. The very first fire unit that arrived on scene was our Type 1 helitanker. And so from a fire standpoint, we're not technology people, but when people like these people put their heads together and they put those tools in the hands of our folks, and we're able to make those decisions like diverting aircraft or augmenting our resources, I'm here to tell you, we are seeing the effects of it. And I really believe on July 6th, if we had not looked at that cameras, number one, we would have had fatalities in the trailer park, and we would have had a fire that was much more severe than it was.
Yeah, and I mean, really nothing additional to add. I think you captured the great points. I think the only point I'd want to make is to kind of reiterate that ongoing commitment that we have in San Diego. We've learned the importance of the collaboration and just look forward to continuing to exercise it moving forward.
Awesome. Since you have the mic, do you have any interesting stories about your discoveries installing weather stations?
Well, I would say one of the biggest parts about installing weather stations was how much we learned about the science of Santa Ana winds. We actually, our first deployment, we put all of them in passes and canyons to be consistent with all of the scientific literature that had been published. But we actually found in San Diego, it was more of a downslope wind, more analogous to a rapid in a river. So it actually took a multi-year deployment and evolution to optimize the network to where it is today. So as I know that we're going to have 800 to 1,000 weather stations from the utilities by the end of this year all across the state, but it is going to be a multi-year refinement to get it dialed in.
Awesome. I'll take the audience over here.
Hi, my name is Dawn Hutchinson, and I don't have a question. I have more of an announcement to make that you all might be interested in. I'm working together with Esri and UC San Diego and Jessica and their Wildfire program and the Alert Wildfire program, and we are working on creating a nationwide early warning alert system for fires. And basically, it's going to tap into the IRWIN system, which is the integrated reporting wildland fire system database. And as soon as a point gets entered in there through dispatch for wildfire, it's going to trigger the Wildfire fire modeling program and create a polygon. And also, we're going to use the monitoring cameras on the mountaintops and this polygon will be used to alert people within the area through the public alert warning system that there potentially is a wildfire or fire in the area, and just warn them to go to and give them a URL to go to a website, and they can get more information on the fire and monitor it and see where it's at and see where it might be going.
Great. Thank you. Do we have over here?
Hello. Hello, my name's Kirk McKenzie. I'm with Cosumnes Fire Department, and compliments to CPUC and the sponsors, the panelists. I travel quite a bit working on technology for first response, and I am incredibly impressed with the room. And I would say you're working on solving a much grander challenge. The U.S. gets maybe 1.25 million fires a year. It's about 240 million calls for service. So as a local jurisdiction provider, I'm interested, and the question to the panelists is, how do we use democratized vanilla data? Because if we all called for a ride share right now, that system would work. How do we integrate crowdsourced data, keep it private, get it back out in a timely AI-enabled manner, and to open silos of these data sets and these resources to push out for all emergencies, wildland included, but active shooter, floods, natural and man-made disasters, earthquakes, and the like.
Do you want to answer?
So I'll address the crowdsourcing. And one of the things we realized pretty early on in the Lake Tahoe footprint is that the minute there was fire, people smelled smoke, saw something was peculiar, that our web traffic would go up really steeply and then basically kill our website. And so obviously we decided we have to be, in some sense, the Netflix of fire. We have to be able to sustain these huge pieces of information going out. Now here's the deal, in my opinion, is that we is great, all these different things, right? But in the end of the day, people like to understand their own situational awareness. And that might just be, do I need to go to the beach at Lake Tahoe? Is it sunny? But by providing cameras to do that, we've trained them for that day that they see smoke, smell smoke. They already know how to use the website. And so what we're kind of doing backdoor is essentially training everybody through our web interface at Alert Wildfire to essentially kind of understand that and be able to, in some cases, leave when they have to. Or in other cases, we've had discoveries where we get tweeted, oh, there's a fire on Peavine Mountain. And I'm like, oh, there's a discovery. So we hoped in that narrow way to use that crowdsourcing to get people engaged around the year, around the clock.
Does anybody else have anything to say about it?
I would just add one on the crowdsourcing. We've stood that up in our EOC, looking at those community-wide impacts of paying attention that, we think, hey, we've set up evacuation points, but I think we're gathering just as much information back more, like at our county EOC, about where are we not meeting community needs. And I'm certainly not a crowdsourcing expert, but I think we're also starting to see that two-way feedback come early on, that identifying problems much earlier with those at-risk populations or those populations that we've moved. So our county, OES, and San Diego staff's a full-time staff that is looking at that information, if that helps you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks. Over here.
Yeah, my name is Alex McCachran. I'm a specialist in advanced sensors for electric power grids. And I wanted to thank the panel and all of the previous speakers for a fantastic education on wildfires. I knew nothing about it walking into the room, and it's incredible what you all do, so thank you. I have what may be a slightly rude question. I see all of this seems to be sponsored, at least in part, by electric utilities. But the sources, the ignition sources for these fires, nobody's saying how much of those come from utilities and how much come from arsonists and how much come from campfires, and then lots and lots and lots of information up till now and coming up about lightning strikes. So it's sort of a two-part question. What fraction of these wildfires are ignited by utilities, And secondly, especially during high-risk times, high-threat times, would those fires have started anyway from some other source because the threat level is so high?
I guess I'll take that one. You know, I don't have the specific data in front of me in terms of utilities. Certainly, I think they've garnered a lot of the media attention, but we have a multitude of fire sources from you know, carbon particles of exhaust, structure fires that get into wildland, people illegally burning, certainly lightning. So, you know, we have dozens of causes of wildfire. I think that what the key to it is when those weather conditions are conducive to a fire and we get a spark, we're going to have a wildfire no matter what that is. And I think that at least in my case, our electrical partner has been very proactive in working with us on these things. We do cost recovery in some of those things when we find others at fault, but they really had the backbone, at least in our county, with their tower infrastructure and that to start our situational awareness gathering.
Okay.
Hi, my name's Rich Drozen. I work for CAL FIRE. My question's on the predictive services and on the fire modeling. Does your fire modeling take into account when the fire moves from a vegetation model into a structural, primarily the structure fires are burning, is the modeling taking into account the additional long-range spotting, the BTUs that are produced? You have a fuel model essentially for structural firefighter that we're seeing a lot now.
I think from my standpoint, I'm going to encourage you to attend the afternoon session with Techno Silva, but the short answer is yes, there are encroachment settings within the model. And what we find is that the encroachment is very different based upon your weather conditions. So we have the ability to adjust that for each model run to account for the amount of embers that would be generated by the strong winds.
Thank you.
Okay. I think we have time for one more, if that's okay. Right here.
Thank you. I'm Subarna. We are an early stage startup called Climaformatics. We do high resolution climate prediction and modeling. My question to the panel is, you know, you're doing so much of active data science around, you know, the wildfire problem. Are you looking at a little bit more advanced warnings so that you can put mitigations procedures in place and plan accordingly? And a lot of what seems to me from the talks I attended so far seems that the focus is more on real time, near time, to the ignition point, and not really seasonal or long term, where actually much longer term climate modeling prediction, you know, particularly vegetation, ecosystem modeling, all of that can be very helpful in planning and therefore making the pathway for the fire modeling that you're doing.
I'm going to let Brian answer the second part of it. Yeah, I mean, we're focusing right now on situational awareness. I will tell you very bluntly that as a fire chief, it is very frustrating trying to educate the general public on the wildland fire problem, because when the winds blow is not the time to deal with it. And we right. Year-round are out talking about defensible space and community education and the need to do community fuel breaks and look at our evacuation planning. But it's really hard to capture that audience until it affects them to say, look, you've got to get out and do some of these things. And I think that you've talked to any of the fire chiefs in this room, they will tell you that until it becomes an emergency for that individual, it's not really an emergency. And I think we have to just continue to this job of really articulating to the residents of California, look, we live in a wildland environment year-round, and it can happen to you. And if you look at some of the 70, 80 mile an hour winds, we're seeing wildfires move much farther into areas that previously we did not have fires. So I don't have a great answer other than at some point people have to realize we have a problem, and the only way we're going to get to this solution is collectively getting all of those people to do their small piece for it. So Brian?
Yeah. Well, and from our perspective at SDG&E, our piece is we are looking at the climate models, as we heard from Scripps this morning and David Pierce, is that we are seeing, for example, less springtime precipitation. What this does is it makes some of our coastal areas and our coastal valleys more vulnerable to potential fire in the future. So in result, SDG&E, as part of its wildfire mitigation plan, we're actually starting to target areas closer to the coast and go in and do system hardening and do some of these upgrades that traditionally you would have seen only in the higher elevations, but this is in response to climate adaptation and trying to stay ahead of what we anticipate in the future.
And do you know how long lead time ahead you're able to see that?
Well, in terms of the overall climate models, we're projecting right now and planning beyond mid-century.
Oh no, that's not going to help you mitigate one season from now. So I'm thinking of a shorter time scale, but more than the 5-day weather and, beforehand. So it has to be short, and it has to be intermediate scale between the climate and the weather to be able to address that.
Thank you.
Okay. Go ahead.
Hi, Mike Wilson, CAL FIRE. I just wanted to address the question earlier about the level of ignitions percentage-wise. So I'll address that on the acreage. It's historically about 9 to 10% of the ignitions are utility-caused, electrical caused. However, it's about 20% of the amount of acreage burned when those are caused by utilities comes from. So it's a bit higher of a percentage in acreage, and that's normally because of time of year, the remoteness of some of the causes on the grid, time of year being high winds, low fuel moistures. So that's where that comes in.
Wonderful, thank you. Is there anything else that the panel would like to close on? Skylar,
I was
yeah.
going to mention on the question earlier on siloing, so that there's systems out there, and I think that's ultimately where we need to get is a statewide network that's either logically connected or physically connected, because it's great that there's all these different efforts out there, but we do need to bring them all together, and siloing is an issue across many government run things, not just this, but getting that data together in one place where CAL FIRE and regional can access it quickly and effectively, along with utilities, is obviously very important and something that we're very much for as well.
Yeah, I'd like to mention just that we take advantage of the internet and it being there, and making sure connectivity is in the places where it's hard to have is super critical and important to keep in mind as we move forward through the state.
And I'd just like to say, I'm here the rest of the meeting. I'm sure Skylar's around. If you have a point of presence in some county in California and you want to come talk to us, because again, it takes a village, and sometimes we need your help to make sure we get the cameras out and get to that 300 number this year and beyond.
Right, so that's a good public service message to keep in mind that this is all for our safety. So thank you very much. I think we're on our way to a break and then lunch.
All right, just a few notes. Lunch will be served both here and upstairs in the orchard room. And when we return at 1:45, there are 2 different tracks. You can find those in your handouts. Those will be located in the Redwood room, out these doors and to the left, and here in the main ballroom. And for those of you who are concerned that you can't be at both, all these sessions are being recorded and will be posted on the website, so you don't have to worry about missing out on either. Thanks.